Meeting to order, and I will ask for the room to be cleared of any media presence. Mr. Barrett, your hand has been noted. I'll come to you momentarily. No start a speakers list. Perfect. Awesome. Welcome. Thank you. Welcome to meeting number 6 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. The committee is meeting today because a request was received from 4 members of the committee pursuant to Standing Order 1064 to discuss their request to undertake a study to review the safeguards in place to prevent conflicts of interest in federal government expenditure policies. Today's meeting is taking place in person, and the proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. Just so that you are aware, the cameras will always show the person speaking rather than the entire room as a whole. Please also note that sometimes there is a delay in your speaker being turned off should the meeting be suspended. Just be aware of this. To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules that are special given the times that we're in. Occupational Health and Safety have requested that we limit our movement in the room and that we wear a mask unless we are seated, at which time the mask can be removed. Floor markings indicate the path of travel, which you will note goes counterclockwise around the room. Please honor that. Individuals should respect physical distancing and remain 2 meters from one another, particularly when without a mask. Seats and microphones have been placed in a manner which respects physical distancing. Therefore, we ask that you remain in the location that has been assigned to you throughout this meeting, please. If you leave the meeting and someone is expected to take your seat, we ask that you use a cleaning wipe, which is provided here in the room, and that you wipe the armrests, the table, the microphone, the earpiece, and the surfaces around you. The same applies if you are taking someone else's seat. Please proceed with cleaning before doing so. To minimize health risks, you will note that limited personnel have been permitted to attend today. Staff have received a phone number where they can listen to these proceedings in real time, and so we're trusting that they're joining us from afar. With regards to washrooms, the washrooms on this floor have been opened 30 minutes preceding this meeting and will remain open until 30 minutes after this meeting. You will note that no paper documents have been distributed here today. All documents have been kept online and you can access them there. Should you require a copy of a document, please advise the clerk of your need by immediately emailing the committee at ethi@parle.gc.ca. Hopefully you've all come prepared. Mr. Fergus, do you have an immediate question to that?
Yes. 2 things. Thank you very much for these les consignes. I, of course, sit very close to the door. If I were to remove myself, do I have to do the clockwise to come around, or can I just come straight to my chair?
Mr. Fergus, why do you have to start with such difficult questions?
It's a fair question.
It's a fair question.
Also, if I were to go get a coffee or a bagged lunch, should I be walking around all my colleagues, or should I just come straight to my chair?
I would ask that you honor the floor markings, and so we would ask that you go and take your food and then continue in a clockwise direction back to your seat. Thank you. Mr. Angus.
Thank you, and I don't want to be difficult, and certainly when I was told to follow the forms when I was in school, I was in the nun's office continually for not. But as a practical, I am at the farthest end. It seems the least people I could contact would be if I went this way. If I go this way, I go past every single person in the room. So I would just suggest it would be less contact at our end of the table if we went counterclockwise, which I have been wanting to do my whole life.
I take your point. I would ask this. If you note that there are other people at the food table who may come in your direction and you would cross paths, I would ask that you honor the footsteps that are on the floor. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions with regards to the guidelines that I have gone through here today? Okay. Awesome. Moving forward then. We are here pursuant to Standing Order 1064, as stated, and the letter that was received by the clerk and then given to me as the chair has a motion within it that reads as follow. That pursuant to Standing Order 1083H, the committee review the safeguards which are in place to avoid and prevent conflicts of interest in federal government procurement, contracting, granting, contribution, and other expenditure policies. And that to provide a case study for this review, an order of the committee do issue to Speaker Spotlight for a copy of all records pertaining to speaking appearances arranged since October 14th, 2008 for Justin Trudeau, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, Margaret Trudeau, and Alexandre Trudeau, including, in respect of each speaking appearance, an indication of the fee provided, any expenses that were reimbursed, and the name of the company, organization, person, or entity booking it, provided that these records shall be provided to the clerk of the committee within 1 week of the adoption of this order. I will now open the floor for discussion with regards to the motion that has been put forward to this committee, starting with Mr. Barrett.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you to committee staff.
Madam Chair,
for
I'd like to be put on a speaker's list, please.
Yeah, thanks to committee staff for arranging the meeting, and this is the first time that this committee has had to adopt it's the new reality of COVID-19 and footsteps on the floor and all the social distancing, etc. So thank you to the clerk, analysts, translators, staff et al. The reason for the letter that was sent to the committee to trigger the Standing Order 1064 was effectively for one purpose, and that's to get answers for Canadians on Justin Trudeau's $900 million scandal. This has triggered an investigation by the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. This is the
And could the member just repeat what did he say? Scam? Is that not on parliamentary language?
Nope. The word scam is the member's word and not mine. I use the word scandal.
Scandal. Okay. Well, I'd still like to understand if that's a parliamentary language or not for this committee.
Thank you, Ms. Shanahan. Noted.
Chair, did you want the clerk and yourself to make a ruling on if this $900 million scandal is in fact a scandal? Did we want the chair to rule on that, ma'am?
I believe what's being requested is that language is watched carefully, and we will allow you to continue forward with your statement, Mr. Barrett.
Okay. In light of the revelations that we've heard, and following on two scandals that saw Prime Minister Justin Trudeau twice found guilty of breaking the law, the Conflict of Interest Act, with respect to his trip to Billionaire Island, with his involvement in the SNC-Lavalin scandal, it's imperative that this committee exercises its function to ensure that Canadians can have confidence in their public institutions, can have confidence in the Prime Minister's office and in the occupant of that office. And when there is reason to call into question that confidence, that the full force of sunlight is affected so that we can have transparency. We heard from Prime Minister Trudeau once that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And this motion is an effort to achieve that effect, to disinfect. So let's put some sunlight on this. And openness and transparency were proclaimed to be hallmarks or were commitments by this government. And we're looking to see that. It's worth noting that in the Trudeau Report 2, the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, Mr. Mario Dion, said that there were 9 witnesses who were not able to testify because it would reveal a confidence of the Queen's Privy Council. Now that is that's a problem because we were told that all cabinet confidences would be waived during that investigation, and that was not the case. It's documented, and so we had 9 witnesses who wanted to aid in that transparency that an independent officer of Parliament was looking to bring to the issue, and it was not possible. I think that the reality that we're faced with when we have a shifting narrative that we pin down all of the facts as soon as possible so that we can assure Canadians that Parliament is exercising its function as a check against the executive branch of government. The records that are asked for in this motion speak directly to this issue that is dominating the front pages of newspapers and the top story on a newscast across our country for weeks. We have this $912 million program that was awarded without competition. I'm aware, and I am sure that I'll hear from members of the Liberal Party that it wasn't a sole source procurement, but we heard yesterday from civil servants that this was not a tendered contract. There was no tendering process. There was no RFP. The contention is we wanted to get it done fast, so we did it. Okay. But why was this organization selected? There's a few distinctions about this organization that are a matter of the public record that need to be considered. One of those considerations is that members of Justin Trudeau's family, including his mother, Margaret, and his brother, Alexandre, together benefited more than $300,000 in dealings with this organization, with We Charity. We know that the Prime Minister's wife is a spokesperson for this organization. We know that Justin Trudeau is regularly involved with this organization as well. We know that Miss Gregoire Trudeau did at one time receive a speaking fee from this organization as well, prior to Justin Trudeau taking office as Prime Minister. So that's a lot of money. That's not an insignificant amount of money when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, nearly $11,000 per engagement for Miss Margaret Trudeau. That's significant. And then for this company to be awarded this arrangement, this contract, without competition, if we want to decide on common language other than calling it sole source, I'm not. If that's an impediment to us getting facts and transparency, I'm happy to engage in that conversation. But it is what it is, and we heard yesterday that no competition was engaged on this. We also know that for July 2nd, 2017, in one of many sole-sourced arrangements with We Charity, there was a more than $1 million contract between the Government of Canada and We Charity that saw Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his mother, Margaret, on the lawn of Parliament Hill. Documents related to whether or not Miss Margaret Trudeau was paid her approximately $11,000 speaking fee for that effort have not been released by PMO, and they have not been forthcoming from We Charity. That's a problem. It's a problem when taxpayer dollars are going out of their hand and then into the hand of the mother of a public office holder, the head of our government. Any reasonable person would see that that's inappropriate. This organization, We Charity, has declined to pay speaking fees to other people with exceptional reputations and perspective in the fields that Miss Margaret Trudeau is also known to be an expert in or well known for in the field of mental health, and that's commendable. I think that that's tremendous that she speaks on that issue. I think that talking about those issues it's so important today, and in the context of COVID-19, I think that we've all heard, and some of us may have experienced in our communities, in our families, that mental health is going to be there are going to be real challenges for folks who've been isolated as a result of this. So very important. But why pay her and not somebody else? Is it appropriate for her to be paid with taxpayer dollars? The mother of the Prime Minister. $11,000 for 90 minutes work. So these questions that have been raised are incredibly important. And I know that there are motions that will come forward from other members today. And I think it's important that we not lose sight of this committee's mandate. This is the Ethics Committee. The Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner is investigating the Prime Minister of Canada. Again, a Prime Minister has twice been found guilty of breaking that law. We also have the Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau, who now has an investigation being conducted by the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner as well, having already once been found guilty of breaking that law. The work of this committee is tremendously important. I recognize that it would cause discomfort to my colleagues on the other side of the room, that it's the leader of their party, members of the cabinet in the same party that they sit in, who are the subject of these questions. I genuinely believe that the sooner we get all of the answers, the sooner we can put this matter to rest, and nothing would give me more satisfaction than being able to reassure Canadians that the rule of law is being followed, that we have an open and transparent government, and that there is no more to see here. For now, there is more to see, and that's why it's important that we get a look at these documents. So I look forward to hearing other comments from members of the committee, Madam Chair, and am pleased to have had the opportunity to move this motion. Thank you.
I will continue moving down my speakers list here. I have Ms. Shanahan next.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I am glad to hear the member actually saying that he's open to us discussing definition of contribution agreement and talking about mandate. But I'd actually like to cede my time to Madame Brière, if possible.
I would have to move down the speaking list. And so, Ms. Shanahan, if you are done, I will move to Mr. Angus, and then I will come to Ms. Brière.
Okay, so then I will continue.
Okay.
Indeed, I would like to bring to the committee's attention our mandate, and the fact that our mandate is actually a review mandate of the work of the Commissioner of Lobbying, of Conflict of Interest and Ethics, of Privacy, and of Lobbying. And given that the Commissioner of Conflicts of Interest and Ethics is now charged with this work, we are not an investigative body. Indeed, we are a review body. We are here to make sure that the Commissioner is able to do his or her work. That is our role. And I'd like to just read out the mandate, actually. I find that that's always very helpful, and to do a review of the other committee mandates that we know are charged with that have motions before them on this issue. So the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics reviews, among other matters, the effectiveness, management and operations, as well as the operational and expenditure plans related to 4 officers of Parliament, the Information Commissioner, the Privacy Commissioner, the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, and the Commissioner of Lobbying. So it's reviewing their plans. It also reviews their reports, although in the case of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, the reports concerned relate to the Commissioner's responsibilities under the Parliament of Canada Act regarding public office holders and reports tabled pursuant to the Access to Information Act and the Privacy Act. In cooperation with other standing committees, the committee also reviews any bill, federal regulation, or standing order which impacts upon its main areas of responsibility, access to information, privacy, and the ethical standards of public office holders. It may also propose initiatives in these areas and promote, monitor, and access such initiatives. So we are not an investigative body, and in fact, that was a discussion that we had in our first meeting here when we set our rules of procedures. And I'm going to switch to French here because je m'en rappelle qu'on a eu.
I remember that we had a conversation, a very detailed conversation concerning the fact that that committee that has that responsibility to look into very sensitive and delicate issues and which affect confidentiality and the private lives of people. We are not there to talk about individuals. It's one thing as members of parliament to live our lives in public, but it's something else to talk about the spouse, the mother, the brother, or the sister, and of all the people who, how can I put this, people who are unlucky to have ties with others. So I myself, I have 8 brothers and sisters. If we start investigating each of our families, that is not the role of this committee, to stain the reputation of people. I believe there's a reason for which the Prime Minister, Mr. Harper, introduced that code and introduced the position of commissioner who has the discretion to carry out the study of a situation that could be disturbing for members of parliament. And the fact that it is done, I have full confidence, unless there are some people here who do not trust the office of the commissioner or have confidence in the commissioner, that will be something else. But as far as I am concerned, I have total confidence that he has all he needs to carry out the investigations he needs to do. Madam Chair, I think we need to look at our mandate. We have a responsibility here as members of parliament to do our duty, the duty given to us by the House of Commons. And that is to make sure that the tools are in place for commissioners who are non-partisan, who are appointed for a given term, who are independent and are there to do a very important job for Canadians. That is, make sure, and I understand my colleague opposite. I understand that he could have questions about an issue, some actions taken by members of parliament, appropriate actions by members of their parliament, or relations, because we are talking about the immediate family members, the spouses and the kids, and there could be other relationships, for example, an entire entourage. Is it reasonable? Is that really what we want to do? Is that really where we want to go? Investigate everyone publicly? When we see that other tools are available for us to use. I talked about the Ethics Commissioner, and we do know that the Finance Committee met yesterday to look into the contributions agreement.
Technical, but the fact that there is a difference between and I'm just looking for my notes here, that there is a difference between for the public between what is a contribution agreement, what a transfer payment is, and what a procurement contract is. So a procurement contract is used to obtain goods or services. It is an agreement between a federal government contracting authority and an outside party to purchase goods, provide a service, or lease real property. Most often, the outside party is chosen through a competitive selection process. A transfer payment arrangement is used to transfer monies from the federal government to individuals, organizations, or other levels of government to further government policy and the department's objectives. Under a contribution agreement, a type of transfer payment, the government sets the high-level funding parameters, including program and policy objectives, desired outcomes, eligible expenditures, and performance measurement. However, the government does not direct or dictate how the recipient will carry out the project. And that indeed, so those are the definitions. But that is indeed the work of Finance Committee, and I dare say we don't comment on other committees, but from the time that I was participating in Government Operations Committee, that is also could be part of their mandate to judge whether to conduct a study as to whether the department work was sufficiently carried out with all the due processes, and was this the appropriate method to use. It is not uncommon, as we heard
just
yesterday.
A point of order, Madam Chair.
Committee.
Sorry, just diligently taking notes from my colleague, and I was just wondering if she could, through you, request if she could restate in her outlining of the committee mandate. I may have missed this, that on the last line that it says the committee can also study any legislation or regulation or purpose initiatives that relate to access to information, privacy, and to ethical standards relating to public office holders. I'm not sure if I missed that, or if she could just restate it, and if I missed that, I'll just correct my notes. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Point of order.
Sorry. Is it a point of order?
Yes. It is difficult for the interpreters to do their job well when we speak very fast. So please speak slowly. That will be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Noted. Ms. Shanahan, do you wish to respond to Mr. Barrett's request?
For the last, in cooperation with understanding committees, the committee also reviews any bill, federal regulation, or standing order which impacts upon its main areas of responsibility, access to information, privacy, and the ethical standards of public office holders. It may also propose initiatives in these areas and promote, monitor, and assess such initiatives. So I did read that out. My understanding is that we are reviewing a bill. So we have, for example, we have a statutory requirement that we need to be reviewing the Conflict of Interest Act. So we may be reviewing that, a federal regulation that comes forward, or initiative. Well, Chair, please. Federal privacy, ethical standards, or that the initiative could be a general study as to whether we have the tools. Is there a gap that's in place? So whether we have the tools. And I think that is what we are discussing here. For my part, I think the mandate is very clear that we are here to examine whether the Commissioner of Conflict of Interest and Ethics has the tools that he needs to proceed with what...
You there. Sorry, the members at this table need to honor other members at this table who have the mic. Please and thank you.
I appreciate that, Chair. Thank you.
Point of order.
Yes, Mr. Angus.
I guess it's that we're being told by the government what our committee is allowed to study when the mandate clearly allows us the initiative to deal with issues of conflict of interest. And that is a long-standing tradition. So I guess I find it a little offensive that I'm being told by the government what we're allowed to study when it's within the mandate. So if the government is going to tell us that they're just going to rag the puck for 3 hours and not allow us to vote, Why don't they just tell us they're going to talk this out, and then we can, go on our phones or do other things. So, but rather than interfere with our work
Is that a
by
point of
telling us that, as the government, that we are not allowed to study what is within the purview of the conflict of interest and ethics codes, I find that personally offensive. So I'd rather her just tell us clearly, are you going to talk the clock out so we can't get to a vote?
Mr. Angus, I'm
It'll
sorry,
be a lot
I
clearer.
don't believe that's a point of order. Thank you. Ms. Shanahan.
Thank you. And indeed, I am very dismayed at a comment of that nature because as a member of Parliament, as a parliamentarian, the mandate that the House of Commons has given to the standing committees is of utmost importance to me. It's something that I think we need to remind ourselves periodically because we are a creature of the House. Yes, we have wide powers to determine our own procedures and what we are going to and how we're going to conduct our business, which we did so actually in our first meeting when it concerned the conditions undergoing in camera, and that was a meeting that I thought it really showed the common interest that we had here as members, that we were sensitive to the fact that people's names can be brought up, personal names. People have nothing to do with running for office or being here, and that we would not be dragging personal names.
Moment. Mr. Gord.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have a bit of creativity going on here. I've been here for 15 years, and even the Prime Minister said in the House that every committee is free to decide what it wishes to do within the parameters of its own committee. I've never heard that we had a very limited mandate to work. It's up to the committee to decide what it wishes to do within its own committee. Since when do we have a mandate of preventing us from studying such a thing or to limit us in doing so? It's the first time I've heard that. With all the respect that I owe to you, Madame Shanahan, I don't understand where you're going with this. Really, I'm seeing quite a bit of verbal creativity coming from you. Ms. Shanahan, I don't think that's the first time you've heard this, because I see that in the past with this committee, and some of you were here before I was. This was raised within the code. I don't like to name names, but there was a member of the Conservative Party who had raised an issue for investigation into certain activities.
Mr. Angus, who said that just because this person, if I need to say the name, I will, but I really would rather not, drags his political enemies before our committee and drags their dirty laundry out.
Ms. Shanahan.
Point of order.
Mr. Angus.
I find it bizarre that I am being quoted when I don't know who I'm being speaking about. So if she's willing to name me, then she should just tell the story.
Okay.
It seems otherwise bizarre that I'm being dragged into
Dean
her
Del
conversation.
Mastro.
Oh, well, Dean Del Mastro, well, then that's fair.
Okay.
Continue.
And do you wish to be added to the speakers list? Are you raising a point of order, or do you wish to be added to the speakers list?
Point of order.
Yes, go ahead.
Microphone, please.
À répétition-là servent avant.
I don't think that repeating certain things will advance the interests of the committee. My colleague will make her speech afterwards. Mr. Angus has the right to make his speech. I do not see how it is useful to constantly interrupt our colleague, the vice chair of the committee, to ask questions or to presume about the content that's going to be in her speech. I would ask, Madam Chair, to please be a little less tolerant of these interruptions.
Thank you, Mr. McKinnon. Ms. Shanahan.
Continue on that quote to refresh the memory of my honourable colleague. Just because Del Mastro quote, drags his political enemies before our committee and drags their dirty laundry out doesn't mean the opposition should try to do the same. I guess my concern is that Mr. Del Mastro has turned our committee into a kangaroo court where due process has been blown out time and time again, Angus said. So even though I have real questions about Del Mastro's activities, I believe he's eligible for due process. And I think that is, when we're getting into the salacious details of different activities, I think we lose sight of the fact that, as another member said, the knife cuts both ways. You can't have it one way when it's your turn, and you can't have it another way when it's someone else's turn. I believe that was Mr. Andrews at the time. So it's indeed the kind of thing that I do not want to see happen in this committee. This committee has a mandate that was given to it by the House. C'est pas la première fois. C'est not.
This is not the first time. It's in Chapter 20 of our procedure, and it's in the standing orders.
And each committee has those mandates with reason, because otherwise there would be redundancy. And I don't think that we don't have the time and the resources nor the desire to see that kind of redundancy between committees. So I think that's really the gist of what I wanted to say here, is that we remind ourselves as to what our mandate is. It is an important mandate, but that we also have respect for the fact that there will be incidents that happen out there outside this committee that, yes, bear investigation and should be talked about, and they're publicly aired and so on, but that within this committee that we would that I think that we need to be respectful of how we speak about people and how we do that here in this committee. So I thank you, Chair, for being patient with me. Thank you.
Moving down the speakers list to Mr. Angus.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank my honourable colleague for mentioning me, and that was a good, timely reminder of past incidents. So I will just say two things. One is, it is definitely within the purview of our committee to investigate ethical breaches within public office holders. But to my colleague's statement, it is also a very important obligation within our committee that we handle these matters in a manner that is respectful and that is not dragging other people in. And so when Mr. Andrews, the former Liberal, was going after Dean Del Mastro, and I fought Dean Del Mastro every single day that he was here, I said that we had to have a proper process. And that's very important, because we are not a kangaroo court here. I think the issue of the Trudeau family being involved, we have to be very careful of, because Madame Trudeau, Sophie Gregoire, has done a lot of really very impressive things. I have no interest in bringing her in any way into this story. Margaret Trudeau has inspired many people by her incredible work as a public spokesperson. I think it is a very terrible situation that we are even having to discuss Margaret Trudeau. Why this issue matters is about we and the relationship to the Trudeau government, because what we learned, and I was very surprised to learn this, that we began to hire members of the Trudeau family after Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister. And then we learned that other key people who, for example, Julie Black, an incredible public figure, was not paid. Theo Fleury wasn't paid. So it raises the question whether or not there was attempt to buy political influence. That, to me, is the issue before us. I think if the Liberals are concerned about how we have documents on members of the Trudeau family, I share that concern. I don't know that we're here to go after Justin's brother, who is a filmmaker. If he's a spokesperson for We and he got paid by them, he probably thought they were paying him because of his incredible skill as a filmmaker. That may be why he signed up. Our issue is whether or not there was an attempt to buy the influence of the government, because the financial interests of the Trudeau family and We have become very convoluted and very connected. So that's what we need to clarify. We know that the Conflict of Interest Commissioner has launched this investigation because of those convoluted ties, as well as the convoluted ties. Now we learn more and more about Bill Morneau's ties with we. So that is of interest. I have no interest in what Bill Morneau's children do with we, if what they're paid, whatever. It's the issue of recusal. It's the issue of buying influence. That's the focus that we have to deal with, which is separate from finance committee. It's separate from government operations. It's about the obligations of public office holders. And it's about the obligations that we established when our committee first began to review the Conflict of Interest Act, and when we're called upon to review it, same as with the Lobbying Act, is to make sure that it applies to everyone in a manner that is fair. That is the role of our committee. So when we had the first finding of guilt to the Prime Minister, we would have expected that measures would have been put in place in the Prime Minister's office to protect the Prime Minister and prevent conflict of interest from happening a second time. That didn't happen. The SNC-Lavalin case was very shocking because it cost the Prime Minister his Chief of Staff, Jerry Butts, and it cost the Clerk of the Privy Council, something that has never, ever happened before. And the Clerk of the Privy Council is someone that we all look to as being the independent, nonpartisan voice of the civil service, advising the Prime Minister to make sure he follows the rules. And that didn't happen. So when we end up in a situation in the middle of a pandemic where $900 million is awarded to a group that has deep ties to the Trudeau family, the obvious question is, why did that not raise flags in the Prime Minister's office? I think we need to hear, and again, I will not support in any way bringing Trudeau family members before our committee because that's not the issue. What we need to hear from is Katie Telford, Chief of Staff. Why is it that there were no checks and balances? This is not difficult stuff to figure out about the obligations to recuse. Why did Bill Morneau not recuse himself? And not just because of his family direct ties, financial ties, but Bill Morneau has been very involved with we as well. And then we learned from finance, and again, finance is a separate committee, but we learned that there was a proposal circulating before the Prime Minister made his announcement that set the stage for we getting this contract. And that report, or that proposal was within the Prime Minister's office, apparently with PCO. It was in finance with Bill Morneau. So the connection, again, we go back to not just the refusal to recuse, but whether or not we was given the inside track of a massive program that was supposed to be doled out in a pandemic to help university students. If that was the case, then that was severe interference in the workings of government, and major questions have to be asked. So we are looking at that, we being the committee, not we the organization, just to clarify there, that our obligation as the ethics committee is to make sure we have the appropriate checks and balances, as my colleague says. Obviously, the appropriate checks and balances were not in place because this scandal should never have happened. It should never have happened in a pandemic of extreme economic uncertainty that a decision would be made to award money so easily to people who were so connected to the Prime Minister's family, where there were clear financial interests going back and forth. That is an embarrassment to all of us. And I think it also is an insult to the work that all of us did across party lines when we were asked at the beginning of the pandemic to reach out to every organization into our region, to identify young people, to identify young placements where we could hire people through Canada Summer Jobs, where so much work was done. And I know across party lines, we stepped up, the civil service stepped up. We identified, in my region, we would have had hundreds of placements. We had all the medical students from Northern Ontario, we were identifying placements for them. We were identifying farm organizations who wanted to hire the ag students coming home. We had law firms calling us because they were being told. They told us Liberal MPs were saying it's going to come through Canada Summer Jobs. And all that got sidelined. And suddenly this proposal came through. This proposal that was announced by the Prime Minister just after we began circulating their proposal, which I admit was different, but it's very similar in terms of what it was to be. So our focus here is not what happened in terms of the other contracts. Our interest here is whether or not there was political influence that was attempted to be bought through the hiring of people close to the Prime Minister, whether the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister's refusal to recuse themselves put themselves in a conflict of interest and put a decision at risk, which has now been a huge embarrassment. And I say this across party lines. In the middle of a pandemic, I've been very proud of the work we've done. I've been proud of being able to stand up for government programs that we worked on and said that we helped change and we improved it, whether it's a small business, whether it was the CERB, the emergency $2,000 a month, that I could say to people in our riding, across party lines, we've been working together. But I cannot justify this $900 million deal that may not even be legal, paying students well below minimum wage, that the more we learned about it, the more we learned that we did not have the capacity to do it. And I cannot stand idly by as a committee member when the questions are being raised about the financial links with the family. So if the Liberals want to put a motion about how we discuss this so that we are not bringing the Trudeau family and embarrassing them for their work that they do on the sidelines, but the Prime Minister should have known that because of those financial links, that this would have put him in a conflict. This is the Prime Minister's responsibility. I would like to see the Liberals say to us, okay, here's a deal. We will bring the Prime Minister to this committee and he will speak as to why he didn't think it was a problem that his family was being paid and that he was awarding this out. It's the Prime Minister's responsibility that I'm interested in. It's Bill Morneau's responsibility that I'm interested in. It's Katie Telford as Chief of Staff, who should have been looking after her Prime Minister and putting some kind of big ethical mitts around him so he didn't keep putting his finger in the conflict of interest socket. That's what I'm interested in. But I'm not interested in our committee being used to go after the individual members of the Trudeau family. And I agree that we can put in a limit on how that's done. We can talk about that. But I would like the Liberals to tell us that they're going to have that Prime Minister sit here and explain why he put his family in that position.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Madame Brière.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam Chair, thank you for giving me the floor today to discuss this important matter. It's surprising to see the opposition repeat how much it trusts the Ethics Commissioner while refusing to let the Commissioner finish their inquiry and work.
Tell us who's next on the, after Madame Brière, who's next on the...
Mr. Fergus is next.
Okay. Can you put me on after Mr. Fergus?
I will put you on next. I will put you on the list.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
en d'autres mots, ce que l'opposition nous dit...
In other words, what the opposition is telling us is that we trust the Commissioner. However, we're going to replace you. Would it not be more appropriate to wait for the Commissioner's report before drawing hasty conclusions? The Commissioner has all the powers necessary to ask for all of the documents deemed relevant and to hear from all witnesses that could help the Commissioner make a decision. If I refer to the notice of meeting, we are here to decide whether we should undertake a study to review the safeguards in place to prevent conflicts of interest in federal government expenditure policies. I'm sure you will agree, Madam Chair, that this is a laudable mandate, an important one. It is also very broad. Madam Chair, I would remind the members of this committee of the mandate. Chapter 13, Section 108 of the House of Commons Standing Orders is clear. Under 3H, it's indicated that the mandate of the Access to Information, Privacy, and Ethics Committee shall include, among other matters, the review of and report on the effectiveness, management, and operation, together with the operational expenditure plans, relating to the Information Commissioner, the review of and report on the effectiveness, management, and operation, together with the operational and expenditure plans relating to the Privacy Commissioner, The review of and report on the effectiveness, management, and operation, together with the operational and expenditure plans relating to the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. The review of and report on the effectiveness, management, and operation, together with the operational and expenditure plans relating to the Commissioner of Lobbying. The review of and report on reports of the Privacy Commissioner, the Information Commissioner, the Commissioner of Lobbying, and the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner with respect to his or her responsibilities under the Parliament of Canada Act relating to public office holders and on reports tabled pursuant to the Access to Information Act and the Privacy Act, which shall be severally deemed permanently referred to the committee immediately after they are laid upon the table. In cooperation with other committees, the review of and report on any federal legislation, regulation, or standing order which impacts upon the access to information or privacy of Canadians or the ethical standards of public office holders. The proposing, promoting, monitoring, and assessing of initiatives which relate to access to information and privacy across all sectors of Canadian society and to ethical standards relating to public office holders. And so, if you will allow me to paraphrase,
line right after that is, and any other matter which the House shall from time to time refer to the Standing Committee, and would also just like to note in the document provided by the House that ethical standards of public office holders is highlighted in point 6 above. Just I'm not sure if we're reading from the same document because that last line was missed. Thanks.
Sorry, point of order. Could you say that slower, because for translation you were speaking very fast? Just repeat it, please.
If I may, Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Barrett.
Okay. And again, je m'excuse, I apologize for, I just didn't want to take up too much of Ms. Briere's time. I wanted to ensure we were reading from the same document, which is in front of me, Standing Order 108. I'm on page 125. On the point that she concluded on, it finishes in bold relating to public office holders and then says, and any other matter which the House shall refer from time to time refer to the Standing Committee. And in the point previous, I noted that that on point 6, ethical standards of public office holders was highlighted as an item for as part of the committee's mandate.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Continuing.
Ce qui est demandé par 4 membres de ce
What is being asked by 4 members of the committee is, what are the existing measures to prevent conflicts of interest within the government when the government uses public funds? As I mentioned earlier, Madam Chair, this mandate is interesting and also very broad. Before such an important mandate, when I see opposition members quoting names and numbers, and I have to ask, do they want to review ethical safeguards set by this government and those before us? Or is the opposition trying to conduct a public trial of certain individuals? Are they looking to draw specific conclusions by targeting people, events, and specific dates? What the opposition seems to want to do is lead an investigation. I would like to remind them that the Ethics Commissioner has the exact mandate to do so, and also has the expertise and the ability to protect the confidentiality of information received. We've held many discussions on this committee of the importance of protecting the privacy of our fellow citizens. What the opposition seems to want to do is to lay out the private lives of individuals rather than rely on an officer of Parliament to protect the confidentiality of the information received. I'm sure that my colleagues around the table understand what I'm trying to say. Politics today, Madam Chair, is a family matter. I wouldn't be here if I didn't have the support of my husband and children. I do politics for them and thanks to them. But it's not because they decided to get on board for this adventure with me that I want them to be focused, or rather want a spotlight shone on them because of my political activities. Focusing on the family members of an MP is something that raises serious questions for me. This type of political game is not something I'm interested in. If we start to target the entourage of our adversaries, where will it end? This is a slippery slope. Do we really want to go down it? I would like to remind my Conservative colleagues of what one of their former leaders said in the House. The tyranny of the opposition majority has turned its attention to the men and women who make up our political staff.
Women who did not sign up to be tried by a committee, to be humiliated and intimidated by members of parliament. Je leur pose donc la question. Est-ce qu'ils...
This is my question. Do they believe our sisters, mothers, children, cousins, in-laws signed on to appear before parliamentary committees? I will assure you, Madam Chair, that contrary to their former colleague, I do not believe that the opposition is a tyranny. However, at a certain time, they did want to prevent political staff from appearing, and yet today, they're asking for our family members to appear.
Dans une vie antérieure,
In a previous life, not so long ago, I worked in family mediation. I worked with different parties to find a compromise, and I'm ready to do it again. I'm ready to work with many stakeholders, with many parties, even if that means something different in that context, to find something that we can work on. However, if the opposition is trying to score political points by concentrating on a single event that the Prime Minister has apologized for, if the opposition wishes to draw in the family of an elected official, I will say immediately, Madam Chair, that I am opposed. Are we above reproach? Of course not. That's why the Prime Minister gave a sincere apology. But if the opposition wants to play this game, to review government expenditures, we could also review the safeguards set up by the government to avoid having a political party pay for political offices with House funds, or take advantage of the fact that opposition wants to have Ian Shughart appear when it came to the issue of Bruce Carson when he was working for the Conservatives. Not to mention links between the Prime Minister Harper's office and the Senate expenses scandal. Yes, we can certainly start pointing the finger at our opponents, but I don't think this is the right way to work on this committee. We can do educational work among the population rather than give over to a political spectacle. All elected officials, depending on who is speaking, seems to be accused of being either crooked or a thief. I think that by setting up a kind of political spectacle, we'll be reinforcing that point of view. I think we have an opportunity to show all Canadians that we do have safeguards and that we can always do better. Maybe you don't know it, Madam Chair, because we're still learning to get to know each other, but I taught at the University of Sherbrooke, the best university of the world in the most beautiful city of Canada.
Fallait je le dise quand même.
I had to say that. I taught at the university I taught a program for people 50 years and older who wanted to continue their education and continue learning. The objective of the program is to facilitate knowledge acquisition, fight isolation among seniors, and encourage the integration of seniors in cultural and social life, promote exchanges, support seniors in their desire to achieve something, and provide the society with new seniors who are dynamic and responsible. I also decided to share my knowledge as a notary and train the future generation. I therefore believe strongly in education, information sharing, and acquisition of new skills. And we have the opportunity to do that exactly, Madam Chair. As I have just said, before I came here, I was and I'm still a notary. That is a profession I adore. It's most of all a profession that is strongly based on ethics and probity. When I took the seal, it was a guarantee of confidence. As a notary, I did not have to represent one party or another. Rather, I had to protect the two parties. I understand that around me, I have elected officials from other provinces for whom that profession could be strange given our different legal regimes. But in Quebec, notaries are recognized as being public officials thanks to their probity and ethics. Madam Chair, to put my speech today in context and to help members of the committee to better understand my submission, it is important to briefly explain the elements that build my morals and professional ethics. As I stated before I was elected in the beautiful riding of Sherbrooke, I was a notary specialized in human rights and mediation. Stringency and integrity are essential for such functions. We don't take sides. We are there for everyone, for all the parties, to make sure that everyone is heard and that everyone's opinion is heard and that ultimately there is a satisfactory agreement for all. As you can see, Madam Chair, ethical issues have always been at the heart of my professional experience. Let me focus on the way we have to deal with these ethical issues. Let me tell you about my second professional challenge. I was lucky for 25 years to be a lecturer at the University of Sherbrooke. Let me take advantage of that to congratulate the university for obtaining international accreditation at platinum level. So the university is now one of the 10 best institutions when it comes to sustainable development in the world. So when I was a lecturer, I used concrete examples from my professional experience when I taught. What came up a lot in my examples and the questions that students asked were ethical issues. Madam Chair, you would wonder, of course, you would be sure that a notary should make sure that ethical issues are taken seriously, just like the concerns. Another concrete example has to do with common good, the importance of having a homologated mandate for ethical and moral issues. And I would like to talk a bit about that. For that illustration, to help to contextualize the ethical issues we have. When people are appointed, we have to make sure that they are totally independent as guardians and take decisions taking into account the best interest of those they represent without placing themselves in a situation of conflict or an appearance of conflict. For members of the opposition who would like to paint us as people who want to prevent an investigation, well, I have 28 years experience as a notary and a lecturer, and that is a guarantee of my probity, and I've not lost that after being elected. And I will continue making sure that the government spend public funds effectively. As Montesquieu said, power must stop power. The checks and balances mechanism require that those of us as the legislator control the actions of the executive. I'm therefore here in my role as a controller of government action. And that's a role that I've not carried out a lot because of the COVID pandemic, I must admit. And during that pandemic, the government, thanks to our wonderful public function, has been able to demonstrate that it was able to quickly disperse, and effectively so, funds to help Canadian families. The government succeeded to do so, and I believe that we have been able to deal with the crisis better because of that, by supporting the members of our ridings when some parties asked us to abandon them. Independent officers of parliament play an important role to ensure accountability at federal level and to make sure that the institutions on which Canadians depend remain sound. And that is why we reinforced the Access to Information Act, because we believe in an open and transparent government. Let me remind this committee that in 2015, we published a document for an open and responsible government, which stipulates the basic principles associated to the roles and responsibilities of ministers in a responsible parliamentary government like ours. It deals the basis of the ministerial functions, both individual and collective, just like the relationships the ministers have with the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, their portfolios, and Parliament. It reviews the standards of conduct expected of ministers and a number of procedural, administrative, and institutional issues. It also offers advice to exonerated staff and useful information for civil servants and Canadians on the systems of Canadian governance. Lastly, when it comes to ethical behavior, ministers must know thoroughly the law or the act on the conflict of interest. A portion of that act is very clear. Allow me to quote it. To deserve the confidence of Canadians, interpreter paraphrases, we must show proof of integrity. It's not only about adopting adequate rules or to make sure that technical exigencies of those rules are observed. As ministers, you, as well as your staff, must respect the highest standards of honesty and impartiality. Furthermore, the way in which you carry out your official duties and your personal business must resist the most tiny public test. That is an obligation that we carry out, not only by respecting the law. I'm here before you as the Member of Parliament for Sherbrooke, Madam Chair, but I'm also lucky to serve Canadians. As Parliamentary Secretary of the Minister of Economic Development and Official Languages, Honorable Melanie Joly. As such, I am very aware of the fact that ministers and parliamentary secretaries must act with honesty and respect the highest ethical norms or standards in order to maintain or increase the public confidence in the integrity and integrity of the government. Ministers and parliamentary secretaries are subject to the requirements of Part 1 of the Guidelines on Ethics and Political Activity intended for policyholders as stated in Annex A, and also to exemplary conditions tied to funding and relationships with lobbyists stated in Annex B. Furthermore, they are bound to carry out their official duties and to carry out their personal business in a way that could resist any rigorous public test. That obligation is not limited to mere respect of the law. I perfectly support those standards that were set forth by our government, and I am certain that it's the same for all members on this side. Once again, let me insist on a very important issue. I am ready to submit myself to a public, rigorous examination, but I do not believe that targeting our families is part or should be part of that rigorous public test. Let me come back to the request to bring in political staff and civil servants. To do that, allow me to quote the work of Dr. Kenneth Callaghan. Politics and policies are separate from the administration. As such, politicians take strategic decisions and civil servants execute those decisions. Civil servants, public servants, do not speak publicly about their personal opinions on policies or the administration of the government. Public servants give objective and frank advice. On the other hand, the executive, the political executive, protects the anonymity of public servants by publicly assuming the responsibility of decisions taken by the department. Once again, it's up to the ministers to appear before Parliament, as my colleague, Minister Chaga, did yesterday. I admit that sometimes public servants may assist ministers in more technical issues when they're answering questions. However, they should not be subjected to public inquisitions as the opposition wants to do, even less so our family members. As I said before, instead of using this committee as a tribunal for inquisition purposes, let's use the committee as a platform for education. If you would allow, Madam Chair, let me explain the fact that, in my opinion, there are some things that the committee should take into account. Ethical issues should remain at the heart of the concerns of members of Parliament. The confidence link between the public and its elected officials is vital. It is thanks to institutions like the Ethics Commissioner, the Lobbying Commissioner, and to this committee, as well as the rigorous work done by the different political parties and this government, that this relationship of confidence would be maintained, but also renewed. The 21st century has asked us to deal with a wide range of disasters that have led to extreme policies that are populistic and clearly have long-term impacts on the political landscape, policies that have to do more with emotions and the psyche of the public. When in a democracy that wants to be, where people want to be sound, open, inclusive, and sustainable, part of the population is led by messages of fear and negative messages. If Plato taught us something, is that the quest for truth should be central in our decision-making, and the rational side of us should take control with pragmatism and good faith, and should be based on what is real. It is therefore essential for Canadian political parties to avoid falling into dogmatism or into a narrative of fear. Let's honor the intelligence of Canadians. And let's make sure, first of all, that we're dealing with questions of public politics with reason. Ethics in political action in this House will be stronger, more sustainable, and more universal. We must also respect national specificities here in Canada. We have always been able to preserve Canadians from political extremism, things that we've seen in other countries, by offering various forms of politics. But most of all, we've been able to offer balanced options that avoid sidetracking parliamentary tools for partisan purposes. Madam Chair, I hope that this balance that is the pride of Canada should be preserved, and that the various members of this committee should remember their role as members of Parliament. Falling into mean partisanship will not serve this Parliament well, but will also not serve all political classes and Canadians well. When ethical issues are raised, it is important to focus on the main concept that unites us, democracy. Coming from the Greek term demos, which means people, and kratos, which means power, the word democracy had its definition changed many times in the course of history. While the Greeks saw democracy as equal opportunity for having a position in the government, today it is accepted that democracy goes through a number of liberties and freedoms and free, fair, and frequent elections, as stated by Robert Dow. But looking at those different visions of democracy, many thinkers have brought in important reflections on the theories of democracy. Alexis de Tocqueville is one of those thinkers, and in 1831 decided to study American democracy, and he came up with a trend. So there's a question that arises: what is the definition that should be used, and what are the sociological and political consequences of the situation? For Tocqueville, many factors come to play when it's time to describe democracy. However, there's a central notion that comes up, which is indispensable: the state of law. The state of law is a concept that makes sure that citizens who are part of the executive are not above the law. Generally speaking, the rule of law describes a nation where no one is above the law. This form of equality between citizens in the face of government action and when it comes to the implementation of the law, according to Tocqueville, is more than simply equality before the courts. This situation has led to a change in the mindsets of people. Members of the society feel and believe that they are equal to others, even if, unfortunately, there are still inequalities. The feeling of equality remains in the minds of the public. Many other characteristics define democracy according to Tocqueville. He says that the process towards democracy is indispensable because it is natural for human beings to try to have the same conditions of life and equality in the standards of living for all. So this situation can only lead to democracy and a rule of law. This would help everyone to improve their conditions, so everyone could aspire for social mobility. This process is therefore indispensable according to Tocqueville. Since this theory of democracy and equality goes through social mobility, upward mobility, material goods are essential, personal comfort, and the desire to get rich personally leads to individualism, which could push the citizen to get away from the public good and to become more isolated. This isolation is a threat to democracy, and this could only be experienced, it can only be avoided if people participate in politics, public politics. To avoid this isolation, Alexis Tocqueville talks about promoting civil associations to promote citizens, to encourage people to participate, put pressure on governments, assemble, get people to discuss about issues. For these associations and democracy to exist, public confidence towards institutions should be preserved. The work of this committee is therefore central, and I am happy to be part of a government that makes sure that individual freedoms are preserved and become vectors of democracy. Madam Chair, let me conclude by saying a few words about the allegation. It's important to say that contrary to what the opposition is saying, it is not a contract that was granted to we, but this was a contribution agreement. This distinction may seem semantic in nature, but the administrative distinction is very important, and the implications underlying it are also important. we need to recall that contrary to what some members of the opposition are implying, we was not selected by the Prime Minister, but recommended by the Public Service, and more specifically, Madam Rachel Wennick, Senior Deputy Minister at the Department of Employment. The department and Ms. Warnick felt that only we was able to provide that service for students within the given timeline, and it would not have been possible to do it within the public service given the timeline. Our government has great trust in our public service. We are happy to be able to say that the Canadian public service is the best public service in the world. As a former lecturer at the University of Sherbrooke, I must say that it's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate that we're seeing delays in the student grant program. Many students in my riding are students who need funds, significant funds, and these needs have been worsened by the crisis that we have been experiencing. And it's unfortunate to see that this money will not go into the hands of the students as quickly as possible. Madam Chair, let me call on all members of this committee to refocus, and let's remember why the committee was set up and what our priority should be to help the most vulnerable Canadians get out of the crisis. Let me call on members of the committee to remain within the limits of our mandate. The Ethics Committee should continue carrying out its mandates and remain an institution where partisanship should not take over issues that have to be dealt with. Some pressure groups are accusing politicians coming up with shows within this committee, acting as if this is a recording chamber where we want our opinions to be recorded without expecting any discussions or advances. Let's remember that we are all working for the common good, and that in spite of our partisan differences, we can act as members of parliament to make sure that our work continues to attain the objectives that we have in common. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Moving down my speakers list, I have Mr. Fergus next.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, I would like to greet my colleague for the speech and comments she has just made to the committee. I found that her comments were relevant, very correct. The only exception is the fact that the University of Sherbrooke is among the best in Canada, but it's the Université du Québec en Outaouais, which is at the top when we look at Canadian universities. So I am proud to be the MP that represents that university in the House of Commons. Madam Chair, I think that Ms. Briere raised some very important issues to remind us of the importance of the work we have to do here. The responsibility of this committee, the responsibility that we all have here, just to confirm, to make sure that we have a system that is sound, a system that is sustainable, a system that is there to look into ethical issues that could be long-standing, not only for this parliament, but for coming parliaments. Madam Chair, let me congratulate you. From the beginning of, I've been sitting in this committee just from the beginning of this parliament, and let me congratulate you for the way in which you preside. I believe that you have shown proof of wisdom and balance, and lots of flexibility, because you allow people express their opinions, and you also make sure that we do not fall into partisanship. particularly since these are ethical issues that are very important. Madam Chair, this is important. And even at the very beginning, I want to commend your work. Your work from the very beginning of this committee. I recall that we had a discussion to come up with the rules that had to govern us around this table. If I may quote Madam Chair, this was on the 19th of February 2020. The pandemic wasn't clear yet, and it was possible at that time to sit here in committee, and more of our assistants were here, and even members of the public were here for public sessions. I found that when we came up with the rules for this committee, we took some good decisions. And one of the decisions we took came after a discussion we had about how to deal with the personal information of individuals when we discussed ethical issues here around the table. And we had a discussion, a beautiful debate between the members of parliament, opposition, and the government. I don't like making that distinction sometimes because, Madam Chair, you've always tried to encourage us to act as members of parliament, full stop, and not as people representing the interest of our political parties. And Madam Chair, there was a discussion between Mr. Angus and myself on how to deal with personal information. If I may quote, and I'll do that in the language of Shakespeare because I have the documents in English before me.
Or Mr. Angus had said, we were having a debate, Madam President, about how do we deal with material and witness selection for people, for individuals. And Mr. I guess where we should start up, Mr. Angus had said that after following from after you gave him the floor, Mr. Angus, we were talking about what to do when the committee, and I'll quote, anytime the committee puts a motion in place, any motion, the committee does have the ability to overrule the motion with unanimous consent. And this would be the standing motion for most cases, but there should be a case where we feel that there's an exception, or the committee feels that there's an exception, then through unanimous consent that could be overruled. And then you turn the microphone to Mr. Angus, to which he said he's very supportive of this. However, and I'll quote, I think we need to be specific. I'm trying to think of the language, because anything that happens in this committee could embarrass someone, because we deal with ethics and breaches, etc. If we have discussions that affect the private information of individuals in extraordinary circumstances, or that are not germane to our study, sometimes we will get information on a person, we will want to talk about whether or not a witness is appropriate, and we have to talk about that amongst ourselves. However, we can't use in camera to avoid discussing certain people who may have to come. I just want to get clearer language on how that will be used so that we're very clear on it. I just want to make sure I quoted that correctly. That's an excellent point, and I think it's particularly relevant to what we're doing here today in terms of what we're trying to get at here. And my colleague, Ms. Shanahan, had talked about a number of ways we want to get that, how do we discuss, and we shouldn't discuss people in public, and she expressed that that wouldn't be on for her. And Mr. Angus said, certainly when we discuss witnesses, we do that in camera, because we have to set priorities, and we don't want that information to be misused or misinterpreted. But we do discuss people here. That's part of what we do with ethics. Issues are brought forward. We name people who we think should be brought. That's sometimes done in public. And then he said, I think the issue is being able to say, I think we should go in camera if we're going to discuss something of a personal nature that should not be germane to the committee. How can we define that a little more clearly so that we're not abusing that? But we're saying that if we're going to go into camera on something because it's because there is specific personal information that should be brought to the committee or should not be in the realm of the public. And so then Charlie, Mr. Angus, if you remember correctly, we had a great little back and forth on this issue.
As I continue to be the subject of this discussion, do I get to at least respond when I'm being asked things in particular? I think it's a good discussion, so I would like to carry on, but being that I'm the subject,
I would like to just set the context.
If he wants to go back and forth, because I think it's a great discussion, and I would love to carry on with him.
Thank you, Mr. Angus.
Thank you,
Mr. Fergus.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Appreciate that. I said I'd like to do. He asked me if I could get some clearer language, and I said I would like to do that. And we tried to figure out how we should make this. And I would make a suggestion, and I said I will make one suggestion. I feel that everyone is in favor of the amendment that you are proposing. Speaking to Mr. Angus, would it be possible to set it aside for a moment to work on it, so we could take some time to just try to get the language right? And then let me just get right down to the crux of the issue. Is that we decided to carve out a little exception. We said, look, we need to trust each other in terms of that we're going to bring forward information and use that information correctly, that we were going to make sure that we don't abuse of these situations. And we tried to make a little bit of an amendment. So I had suggested, Madam President, that we would want to make sure that when we do go into in camera, that we would do so, and we added the proviso to our standing order D that we would protect the privacy of any individual. And we had that debate, and eventually we adopted that. And I think this is relevant, Madam Chair, because when we take a look at the motion which is before us, which is being brought forward, et je vais le citer qui vient de Monsieur Barrett.
And I will refer back to what Mr. Barrett said. According to Standing Order 1083H, the committee reviews measures that are in place to avoid and prevent conflicts of interest in federal government policies when it comes to contracts, subsidies, contributions, and other expenditures. I fully agree with that. That falls fully within the framework, within the responsibilities of our parliamentary committee. Mr. Barrett went on to say that to provide case studies for this review, a committee order should be admitted to the Speaker's spotlight to get a copy of all the documents relevant for an appearance organized since October 14th, 2008 for Justin Trudeau, Sophie Grégoire Trudeau, Margaret Trudeau, and Alexandre Trudeau, including for every intervention and indication of the honoraria that were granted, expenditures repaid, and the name of the company or organization of the person or entity that organized it. This information must be communicated to the clerk of the committee within 1 week of the adoption of the order.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair, I had the opportunity to study some Latin, and there is a precept. Quando alicid prohibitar ex directo prohibita ecpa obliquio. And that means you cannot do indirectly what you are not allowed to do directly. And what we are doing here is getting around getting around the parameters of our responsibilities here at the Ethics Committee.
La preuve était dans le discours.
The proof was in what Mr. Barrett said. He said,
Get a look at these documents. We're going to call this a case study. On ne peut pas faire ça.
We can't do that.
Ultra vires.
It's ultra vires, our mandate. It goes beyond our mandate. We cannot do indirectly what we are forbidden from doing directly.
Je mélange mon latin avec mon français.
Sorry, I was getting my Latin mixed up with my French.
Madame, ma collègue, Madame Brière.
My colleague, Madame Brière, said in her speech, correctly, that we have to have trust in our institutions and our officers of Parliament. They have the mandate to review these types of issues. She said that what we want to avoid, Madam Chair, is a situation in which we take personal information from people who have a connection to us as politicians, and then to air this information publicly. Madam Chair, I'm ready to do that for myself. It's clear that that's part of our responsibilities. That is why we have all, as members of Parliament, rappel au règlement, point of order.
Understand who is on the speakers list?
I have Mr. Green and then Ms. Shanahan.
Okay, thank you. Did not
We need for, like, the last
Mr.
20
Scarpelliccia?
minutes.
Mr. Angus, you are on there according to the order. And so, yes, Mr. Scarpelliccia is on there, and then Mr. Barrett, and then Mr. Angus.
On that list as well.
Madam Goodrow, and then Mr. Keurig.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Fergus.
Thank you. Madame la Présidente, j'étais juste en train de...
Madam Chair, I was just saying that there's a very important point. We've all made our statements and filled out our documents, but not on behalf of another politician, not on behalf of an officer of the government of the day. We did this and submitted it to an officer of Parliament. And that's a very important point. This is the proof. This is the guarantee. We hand this over to a third party who is impartial. This third party and their team will evaluate that information and make sure that the declaration of our holdings, our liabilities, our responsibilities, to ensure that we can make decisions where we do not necessarily have a connection to the result. And if here we have cases where parliamentarians have made decisions that are not consistent with the legislative framework that we all set up as parliamentarians, then it is up to the commissioner, in this case, it is up to the commissioner to make that investigation, to obtain all the information he needs, to draw a conclusion, and then to reveal that information to Parliament. It's happened several times. Before I get to my conclusion, please note that this is not information that we're giving to an individual that represents a party or the government of the day. This is an impartial person. What we are doing today is getting around the commissioner's responsibilities. We're saying that we are going to collect that information. And we are going to conduct the assessment. And I understand that, it's a battle, it's a good fight. We can decide to play that game. And now, the majority can determine whether we play that game or not. You are part of the majority now, but one day you'll be part of the minority. Do you really want to politicize this type of information? And this isn't just coming from us. This is information coming from those close to us. Starting perhaps with my brothers or sisters. After that, cousins. And why not? The neighbor in my neighborhood. Where does it end? Who is going to make sure that this information is relevant? And that we are not starting a witch hunt? That is a good question. It's an important one. And when I look at everyone around the table here, when I look at everyone who filled out the documents that we had to fill out, I see that everyone, or almost everyone, submitted their documents, which are published, where we can see who has what obligation, their spouse, the companies they're part of. There was one of the people who had moved the motion before us has not yet published this type of information. Do we want to score political points with that? I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think that that's a good idea. I do not think that's a good idea, Mr. Barrett. So maybe you should talk to one of your colleagues. The question, Mr. Barrett, is we don't want to play these games. It's not fair. It's not good. We have to take the time and trust that the commissioner and the commissioner's office will ensure that all of that information is duly collected. If there are questions, they will be answered, and at some point that information will be made public. But to leave this up to us, parliamentarians, to do that, oh boy. We can play hardball.
Make what should be a very noble calling and profession, a necessary one that will be attractive to people to come out to participate. So let's be really careful. Let's do the right thing. This is why Mr. Angus and I had this discussion. I shouldn't say Mr. Angus and I had this discussion. We all had this discussion back in February when we were setting out the ground rules for this committee. It was an important discussion. It's one which we did in the absence of any particular political gain to set it out. And now we want to do indirectly what we said we wouldn't do directly. I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem. That's a problem that we really must try to avoid. So I call upon all of you. I plead amongst all of you as I'm no more special than the rest of you on this one. I'm a bit of a political parliamentary nerd. I used to subscribe to Hansard when I was 14. Who does that?
Order, can we declare who actually would have done that around? I want to know who I'm dealing with here.
I love this place. I think it's a great place. Not because I'm here, but because I think of what it represents. Democracy is fragile. If we take a look at the 5,000 years of reliable human history, oral and written history that we can turn to, and we take a look at the opportunities, as Madame Brière had pointed out, the demos and the kratos. When we take a look at governance by the people in its most extreme form, we talk about the Greek city-state, where you had to be, well, you certainly weren't my color, and you had to be male, you had to be over a certain age to be eligible, and you had to be a free person, not a slave, to participate in the affairs of the state, of the city-state. If we even take that as an example of democracy, which we would find repugnant to ourselves today when we have universal suffrage and participation. From that to what we even have today, if you take a look and you add up all the years that we've had this form of government by the people, for the people, you're looking at somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 years of that. And it's certainly not a continuous history. It happens, it occurs, falls off and disappears. It picks up again in some form, continues for a while, and then it falls off again. We have a great responsibility to tend to this very resilient but yet very delicate system that we have here. We have to sometimes look beyond that. We have to avoid the temptations sometimes that we are faced to try to seek short-term, very short-term advantage or interest, and to think of the longer term. And I think we're at one of these points. Where do we stop? We're going to seek out the information of a mother of a politician, a brother of a politician. Where does this stop? One of the motions says we should be seeking out information from every single member of the government, every single cabinet member, and to see what we get from that. It's called a fishing trip. We're going out and we're going to see what we can find. We shouldn't do that. We have a commissioner of ethics. We have the office and counselors who are there to provide us with information and counsel, who we could call up at any time to see if our affairs or activities are in order. It's in our benefit to have that. But to take on that, to arrogate that responsibility to ourselves, is an error. And one which we have seen, I think it was a former Conservative House leader that my colleague had quoted, if I can just find that now, who had said that the men and women who work in this area, they could be meaning our staff, they could also be meaning people who we know or people who we're related to, did not sign up to be tried by a committee, to be humiliated and intimidated by members of parliament. Implicit in that is that exactly what I was saying, to be using this kind of information to seek short-term political gain. People didn't sign up for that. We shouldn't give in to the temptation to do that. We should, however, ensure that the information, that the ethics counselor has access to the information that, in this case, he needs. And we should, perhaps, invite the commissioner here to making sure that he has that access to that information. And we could ask how we could play a role in helping him discharge his duties. That would be an appropriate role for this committee. That's a role that falls right into the specific mandate of our committee. And when we take a look at the general mandate towards standing committees, what's a general mandate? That, and I quote, again, I'm not the first one to do it here, but from chapter 20 of the 2009 second edition House of Commons Procedure and Practice. They are, I'm referring to standing committees, empowered to study and report to the House on all matters relating to the mandate, management, organization, and operation of the departments assigned to them. More specifically, they can review the statute law relating to the departments assigned to them, the program of policy objectives of those departments, and the effectiveness of their implementation thereof, the immediate, medium, and long-term expenditure plans for those departments and the effectiveness of the implementation thereof, and an analysis of the relative success of those departments in meeting those objectives. Now, that's all related to departments. It goes on to say that in addition to this general mandate, other matters are routinely referred by the House to its standing committees. Bills, now, understand that, referred by the House to the standing committees. Bills, estimates, order and council appointments, documents tabled in the House pursuant to statute, and specific matters which the House, I again repeat and underline, wishes to have studied. In each case, the House chooses the most appropriate committee on the basis of its mandate. And then further on, talking about the specific mandate, so moving away from the general mandate, but the specific mandate of this committee. The Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy, and Ethics reviews, among other matters, the effectiveness, management, and operation together with the operational and expenditure plans relating to 3 officers of Parliament: the Information Commissioner, the Privacy Commissioner, and the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, which is germane to our discussion today. It also reviews their reports, although in the case of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, the reports concerned relate to his or her responsibilities under the Parliament of Canada Act regarding public office holders, and reports tabled pursuant to the Lobbyists Registration Act. In cooperation with other standing committees, the committee also reviews any bill, federal regulations or standing order which impacts upon the main areas of responsibility: access to information, privacy, and the ethical standards of public office holders. It may also propose initiatives in these areas and promote, monitor, and assess such initiatives. And this is the thin branch which some of my colleagues are trying to hang on to.
Point of order, Madam Chair. Just for the committee's reference, could we just find out what version the member is reading from? Because I thought
Second edition, 2009.
Okay, I just feel like that's not the most current version.
I believe it is. I believe that's the version which was provided to all members of Parliament.
So, Madam Chair, I'll address my comments to you. My understanding is that the reference was to less than the current number of total officers that this committee, whose work that this committee reviews. And so, just if we're reading it into the record, I'm just not sure that is the correct text. If you could clarify, or through you, if the member could clarify.
Mr. Fergus,
I would hate to be.
If I may.
I would like to apologize to my honourable colleague that it would seem, Madam Chair, that there is a consolidated version of October 2019, and
I just want to make sure, Madam Chair, that our bedtime reading is non-fiction and not fiction.
Well, it's not that it's fiction; it was perhaps out of date. So my apologies to the honourable member.
Mr. Fergus, I think, sorry, if I may, you can continue, but just I was following along in my own copy here, and one of the things that was stated was that there are 3 officers in the statement that you made, and it just has been updated to say that there are actually 4 officers. So the lobbying commissioner, of course, has been added to the mandate of this committee.
And this is where I was incorrect, but let me just read off this part and to see if there's a distinction in that thin branch, which I think that our members were trying to hang on to.
So,
yes. If Madam Chair would indulge me just for a second, please. And other members were to indulge me. My apologies for this. It makes a point that it's really important when we hand members of Parliament after the election standing orders that we should provide them with the most recent standing orders. I'll speak to the chair of the House about this. When it gets to the point which I was trying to make in regards to where we are at, and I'm looking at the access to information. Here we go. So then we go to section 5, the review and report on the review and of. I'm sorry because there's the spacing problem in the printout here. I'll say it in French because it seems to not have this problem. L'étude des rapports.
The study of the Commissioner of Privacy reports, the Commissioner of Information, the Lobbying Commissioner, and the Ethics and Conflict of Interest Commissioner, pursuant to the Parliament of Canada's legislation, are considered public office holders. Reports tabled under the law for access to information and protecting privacy are deemed to be referred permanently to the committee once they are tabled before the House of Commons. And presentation of these reports. With other committees, the study of all federal legislation or bill or regulation which has an impact on access to information or privacy of Canadians or on standards when it comes to ethics for public office holders. And 7, formulating proposals of initiatives when it comes to access to information and the protection of privacy, when it comes to standards and ethics for public office holders, as well as the promotion and control and evaluation of these initiatives, as well as any other matter that the House refers to the Standing Committee.
Dans la guise plutôt.
Madam Chair, by trying to say that there's going to be a case study without any parameters that are specific, dealing with specific individuals, as I said, we are trying to do indirectly what we are not allowed to do directly.
As someone with many years of experience of filibustering, and I have been called out by the chair many times, if one is going to filibuster and rag the puck till 2 o'clock, which they're right, they have to be introducing new material. But if they're just repeating what the other members have read into the record, they're actually just trying to walk the clock down. So I would ask my colleague to, I love the stuff about ancient Athens. If he wants to talk about Sparta, he can talk about other things as long as he brings the relevance. But to refer to the same things that Ms. Shannon has already spoken about is dilatory. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Mr. Fergus, please continue.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I take it from the absence of a statement. I really do feel, actually, I'm not trying to repeat material which has been suggested by other members, but trying to point out that what is happening here, ce qui arrive ici, Madame la Présidente.
What is happening here, Madam Chair, is the fact that we are trying to do indirectly what we can't do directly. And going by the question, let me see how that was written in a case study. For this study, Madam Chair, we were circumventing the standing orders of the House of Commons. What we need to do, Madam Chair, is simply allow the Ethics Commissioner do his job, allow him carry out his investigation, let's avoid the temptation of doing a witch hunting, looking for information about individuals who, and that is to be seen, who have a relationship with the affairs before us. Let's allow the commissioner do his job, carry out his investigation, and then we will avoid a situation where we would, or rather we would create a situation where we would simply be looking for information to find out if there's something damaging contained in the information or have a clear and specific objective. If there are any shortcomings in the law governing the Ethics Commissioner, the Conflict of Interest Act, it's going to be up to us to look at the situation, do an assessment, do a proper study, and then try to fill the gaps or correct the shortcomings. And that is not the case here with this alleged case study. We are using the exception to justify a plan, and that's not a good idea. Madam Chair, I believe I have confidence. I have confidence in the wisdom, the collective wisdom that sits around this table to make sure that we avoid such a situation that could harm our democratic institutions. We should always encourage people who will come after us, because there are people who will come after us. We are here temporarily. We are all here temporarily. And the people who will come after us should see that it's worth the trouble, it's worth the effort to vote, to be voted to the House of Commons, and even more so to continue our democracy in a beautiful way. If we act otherwise, that would be concerning. On that note, Madam Chair, I would conclude my comments. Thank you very much for your patience.
Mr. Fergus, thank you very much for your comments. I have Mr. Green next on the speaking list. Mr. Green, because you are not a regular member of this committee, nor have you been substituted in, you are permitted to speak. However, if the committee objects, then unfortunately I cannot give you the floor. At the will of the committee, you can go.
Point d'ordre. Madame la...
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Je profite de l'occasion.
Let me state that from the very beginning, when all committees met in person, each of those committees respected health rules. That being said, there was a rule that was established. If you are saying that the rule is being respected now, then I'll do otherwise. Let me ask you a question. Are we respecting the prescribed health rules as was agreed upon in committee?
The health rules? Is that what you were saying?
Le nombre.
In terms of the number of people, we had to have one member of the Bloc Québécois, an MP from the NDP, and if you're saying that it's okay, then we can proceed.
It is the member's parliamentary privilege to be at this meeting, and so accommodation is being made for him to be here. Mr. Green.
Mais ce n'était pas
That was not the initial agreement, and that is not what the other in-person committees have done.
Again, it is his parliamentary privilege, and it is the responsibility of this House, and for me as chair, to respect his parliamentary privilege. He has every right to be here.
Donc les consignes sanitaires.
So the health guidelines do not prevail over privilege.
Correct. Mr. Green.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I'd also like to thank the staff for setting us up in such a way where I feel very comfortable in my 6 meter or 2 meter distance from my colleagues, as well as the directions of the floors and all the protocols, notwithstanding coughs. And I would like to also extend through you the gratitude to this committee for having the courtesy for allowing me to speak as the deputy critic for ethics. It's been very illuminating to be here today. We have heard lots from the government side, certainly anything from, as was referenced earlier, stories of Greece, quotes in Latin, biographical stories. It's good to get to know everybody in that way. And I do feel that this is a very critically important issue for Canada, for this committee in particular. And I just want to draw attention to, notwithstanding the loquacious nature of my colleagues, the narrowing of the scope that I feel like that is happening here. There's been some very good procedures, standing orders that have been read into the public record. And certainly for the viewers who might not know that, and even for myself as a new MP who may not have read every single aspect of the mandate of this committee, it's been very important. And Ms. Chair, I'd also like to acknowledge the work from my friend along the way who pointed out some of the omissions in the mandate of this committee, which I think are also important to fulfill the public record. We've heard a lot about the appropriateness and the extension of conflict of interest, of the political involvement of potentially family members here in this committee. And I would agree with my colleague, Charlie, that I have no interest nor do I think it's appropriate to necessarily bring spouses and family members before this committee for that way, because quite frankly, they haven't signed up to be cross-examined at committee. However, each one of us has. And I think that there is a responsibility for the Prime Minister and for senior members of both his staff and of course of other ministries to be present here. But I did want to remind members of this committee in my early learnings, under our conflict of interest, it is very clear. So despite the very liberal definitions of conflict of interest, I thought it'd be important for this committee to add the following contribution: that family members, relatives, are included 7 times in the Conflict of Interest Act, and that the following are the members of a public office holder's family for the purpose of his act: his spouse or her spouse or common law partner, and his dependent or dependent children and dependent children of his or her spouse or common law partner. Again, no interest in bringing any of those people before the committee. But relatives are persons who are related to a public office holder by birth, by marriage, by common law partnership, adoption, or affinity of the public office holder's relatives for the purpose of the act, unless the commissioner determines otherwise. And I'll go further to state later on in Part 1 of the Conflict of Interest Rules that for the purpose of this act, a public office holder is in conflict of interest when he or she exercises an official power, duty, or function that provides an opportunity to further his private interests or those of his or her relatives or friends, neighbors, to improperly further any person's private interests. I think that's a very germane and important point. That we also look at influence under Section 9. No public office holder shall use his or her position as a public office holder to speak to...
Mr. Green, just one moment, please. Mr. Fergus.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Point of order. I'm just wondering if the member can... I might have misheard. Did he say that that definition of family and what would be determined as being germane would be done by the commissioner?
It's as it's related to the act. Yeah. So for the purpose of this committee, what I would suggest through you, Madam Chair, is that one of the classic, speaking of Latin, one of the classic rhetorical fallacies is that of the modal scope fallacy, where you narrow the terms to such a place where you can't, you can't help but further your side. So I'm looking to define these terms in a way that doesn't mislead the public. So that the public, we've heard witch hunt, we've heard circus or show. And what I'm concerned about is that if there's a show to be had, it's one of contortion, wherein we're not actually sticking to the act. And so I just want to, for the purpose, again, because people are tuning in, this is broadcast live, and I want to make sure that they have a clear understanding of what influence looks like under subsection 9, that no public office holder shall use his or her position as a public office holder to seek to influence a decision of another person so as to further the public office holder's private interests, or those of the public office holder's relatives as defined by the act, or their friends to improperly further another person's private interests. So the influence, I think, is an important consideration, given that these are not conversations of backbenchers, of regular members of parliament, but of cabinet and of the highest echelons of power and privilege in this country. The other thing that I want to just draw our attention to, because I did as a new MP, and I see some of my other colleagues who are new, we went through the whole process of the conflict of information, the reporting processes, right? Where you had to declare. It was a very fulsome discussion. And one of the things that they taught us on was on gifts, quite frankly. And I get very caught up in some of the what I'll call political weasel words. And I'm not saying that in a pejorative way, but that's a term that's generally accepted to slip and slide around definitions, around what a contract is or a contribution agreement, around what an honorarium is. And I think we can generally agree on the fact, Madam Chair.
Chair, weasel words?
Madam Shanahan.
Yes, is that parliamentary language?
There's a whole book on it, actually.
I don't believe that the term was used in reference to an individual. It was used in reference to words, so I'm going to allow it. Go ahead, Mr. Green.
I'm very careful so as not to overstay my very early welcome here in this committee, and I do appreciate the sensitivities around it. As I have the most illuminating lectures on the segments of the mandate of this committee as well as the act. But I do want to draw attention to, what I recall to be a very clear, what it was determined to be a material gift. And if I'm recalling, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Madam Chair, but I believe the materiality of that was $200. And so when we talk about honorariums, when we talk about conflict of interest, when we talk about the Conflicts Act's definition on relatives, when we look at Section 4, Section 9, and then when we get into what compliance looks like as it relates to gifts, I think that there is plenty for this committee. And I do, hopefully, if I'm given the opportunity in the future plan to be here in an official way, I do believe that those are of the public interest and are well within the mandate of this committee, notwithstanding the modal scope fallacy that has been presented by the very, I'll call them small L liberal, so as not to be confused, small L liberal definitions of the terms have been put forward. So with that being said, I did want to, take my time as I've been here listening so closely to ask this committee to consider when they are presenting aspects of the act, aspects of the mandate, that we do it in a full way that doesn't omit material definitions that have already been put before the House and are included in the standing orders. Those are my comments, and I do appreciate your indulgence for allowing me to say the same. Thank you.
Please. Point of order.
Mr. Angus.
Yes, I just want a clarification because he mentioned gift under the Conflict of Interest Act being $200. He mentioned honorarium. Is he suggesting that anyone in the Prime Minister's family was paid more than $200 for their work with WE?
Well, what I'm suggesting is these are all, Madam Chair.
Sorry, Mr. Green. I just have to allow the question actually just to flow it out there. Thank you. Do you have a point of order, Mr. Purkis?
Well, I do. Relevance. The restrictions on honorariums refer to members of Parliament and public office holders only.
Thank you, Mr. Purkis.
You're welcome.
Madam Shanahan, you have the floor.
Can you clarify the speaking order again?
I sure can.
Chair?
Absolutely. All right. So next up, after Madam Shanahan, we have Mr. Charpelager. We have Mr. Barrett, Mr. Angus, Madam Goodrow, and Mr. Couric.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And Mr.
Point d'ordre.
Point of order. Specifically, some people have taken the floor 2 or 3 times, so I just want to make sure that the order is correct.
Madam Goodrow, I have done my best to keep good track of everybody's hands as they've gone up, and I have had the capable help of the clerk. So thank you very much for raising that point of order. I'm pretty sure we've got it handled.
Excellent. Thank you, Madam Chair. Puis je suis consciente que c'est le deuxième.
I am aware of the fact that I'm taking the floor the second time, and I hope everyone will have the opportunity to speak, of course.
Was the part of our mandate, which concerns because we have a statutory review that is due. And it was very interesting to look at the last statutory review that was done in 2014. I believe, and to look at some of the elements that were introduced there as recommendations, both in the majority report and in the minority report. And I think it goes to the point that I was making earlier, Madam Chair, about the very important work of this committee to ensure that indeed, and I think we have 2 separate things that we're talking about here. The Act itself, with all of the clauses and provisions therein, and then the fact that it is the Commissioner of Conflict of Interest and Ethics that is charged with fulfilling the Act or executing, or maybe someone may have better words than I do for that. To carry out the intentions, the will of Parliament in making sure that the act is respected, and bearing in mind that any finding of the commissioner is indeed then a violation, and that he or she then is able to. I believe it's $500. I may be incorrect. This is why I'm looking forward to the time that we are actually going to do a study of the act itself, because I think there's some.
Point d'ordre, malheureusement.
Point of order. Unfortunately, I can't hear. They're doing a very good job, but it's difficult.
C'est vrai. So, excellent. Donc, c'est mieux mettre.
They're excellent. I hope it's better now for the interpreters.
Wanted to put into the record actually some of the very interesting recommendations of, again, someone who I have huge respect for in this committee, and I believe is the doyen of this committee, the dean of this committee, and that is Mr. Angus, and he can correct me if it wasn't himself that was present on the statutory review. But the 10 recommendations that were put forward are, I think, give us much pause for thought. And I believe that there are a couple of recommendations that have been adopted since that time, including adding public office holders such as the Governor of the Bank of Canada, which is very important. So the first recommendation being, giving the Commissioner the power to administer financial penalties and other penalties for breaches of the Act where an examination results in the finding of contravention, including but not limited to suspension for a specified period, suspension of members' right to vote for a specified period, require reimbursement of the value of the gift, hospitality, or benefit received, impose a fine not exceeding $5,000. Because that's really, I think, coming to the heart of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to dissuade members of Parliament from contravening the Act. Number 2, enshrine ministerial accountability guidelines into the Act. Amend Section 16 of the Act to include Annex B, entitled Fundraising and Dealing with Lobbyists, Best Practices for Ministers, Ministers of State, and Parliamentary Secretaries, as follows. A, ministers of state, and parliamentary secretaries should not seek to have departmental stakeholders included on fundraising or campaign teams or on the boards of electoral district associations. B, ministers of state, and parliamentary secretaries should ensure that government facilities and equipment, including ministerial or departmental letterhead, are not used for or in connection with fundraising activities. C, ministers of state, and parliamentary secretaries and their staff should not discuss departmental business at any fundraising event, and should refer any person who wishes to discuss departmental business to make an appointment with the minister's office or department as appropriate. D, ministers of state, and parliamentary secretaries should ensure that fundraising communications issued on their behalf do not suggest any connection between fundraising and official government business. 3, the third recommendation given in the minority report, allow members of the public to bring complaints, not just MPs, so very interesting. Number 4, extend the definition of ministerial staff to include all work, including contract and volunteer work. 5, expand the definition of public office holder to include all governor and council appointees, including the Governor of the Bank of Canada, I believe which has been done. And so some of these recommendations, Madam Chair, came from well-known organizations, Democracy Watch, experts in the field. I think it was a very comprehensive study, although clearly one that was quite controversial because there are 2 minority reports, and it just gives us an idea, flavor for the kinds of discussions that we can look forward to having. The 6th recommendation out of 10, empower the commissioner to continue investigations that have been referred to the RCMP. 7, reduce the value of a gift that requires disclosure from $200 to $100. 8, maintain automatic divestment rules for reporting public office holders with significant decision-making power or access to privileged information, including, but not limited to, ministers, ministers of state, parliamentary secretaries, chief of staff, deputy ministers, ministerial staff, and employees of ministers' offices. Maintain automatic divestment for appointees to agencies and bodies with broad mandates. All other appointees should be subject to a case-by-case divestment of controlled assets. Number 9, define and toughen post-employment and secondary employment rules for MPs and senators. And number 10, include an apparent conflict of interest in the definition of a conflict of interest. So I think that that there's much food for thought there, and I thank the New Democratic Party for the work that they have done in the past and continue to do in this very important area. And so as I put aside the idea that we should, and I look forward to us doing the statutory review of the Act, it is the question of, do we have full confidence in the Ethics Commissioner to carry out his duties? And I just would say to that the commissioner, it's in the Act, the qualifications and the standards that the commissioner must hold for the 7-year term. And I think that I, for one, I'm very satisfied that we have someone in whom we can have full faith. So I will leave it to that. Thank you.
Mr. Scarborough.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I, too, would like to commend you on the manner in which you are chairing this committee. I'm not normally a member of this committee, and I'm here today substituting for another member. Excuse me, but I'm very pleased to be part of the discussion on a very important issue. And I, too, would like to salute a university in my riding. I happen to be fortunate enough to have a part of a university in my riding. I have the Agricultural and Environmental Sciences faculty of McGill University in my riding in Sainte Anne de Bellevue. And of course, they are leaders in both areas, not only nationally, but internationally. I think the point that's being made by different members is that we have an incredible education system in this country. And I think that is one of the reasons that we have such a strong economy and such a bright future as a nation. But in the amount of time that I would have today, I would like to talk about politics. And I believe that what I have to say relates in many ways to what Ms. Shanahan has said, what Ms. Brière has said, Mr. Fergus has said, and in fact, Mr. Angus has said, who I know is a formidable debater. I know him to be someone who seeks the truth, but is also a very able political debater in the House. And I think...
Sorry, Madam Chair, point of order. If people are going to be saying nice things about me, could you at least turn the camera on me, because my mom might be watching? No, it's true. Not true. My mom never watches Parliament, but I'm going to call her tonight and tell her that Francis, she'll love it that Francis, because she loves Pope Francis, she'll like you, Francis. Yes, so yes. Thank you.
She'll
continue. Keep talking about me. If you're going to filibuster, keep talking about me. I don't mind.
But yes. The point I was trying to make was that I know you put a political lens on many things. Yeah. But we're here because we believe in politics. We're here because we like politics. And when we got involved in politics, Madam Chair, we knew what we were getting into. We knew that it would be our name on the ballot, that we would be responsible for what we said, whether in the House or in committee or in a newspaper article, and we understood that if sometimes we don't say things the way we should, or if we slip on a banana peel, we would have to deal with the consequences and the embarrassment sometimes of being so-called misquoted or what have you. So we got into this line of work very cognizant of what it involves, and I would say that our immediate families did as well. And I would imagine that anyone who entered politics, who has entered politics, has had discussions with immediate family, especially with spouses, because sometimes children are too young to really have a say in what in our decision to enter politics. But I would hope that everyone would have the agreement of their spouse to enter politics, and if not, I think that could lead to trouble down the road. But that's not the topic of discussion here. This is a political committee. I think we've conducted ourselves in a very respectful manner today, and with a lot of professionalism. But that should not obscure the fact that this is fundamentally a political committee. The ethics commissioner, on the other hand, is not a political person. And that's a very, very important distinction to keep in mind as we discuss this issue. This is a political committee. The opposition is, their role is to score political points. I know this because I've been in opposition. I've been on the government side. I was on the government side when I was first elected. Then I sat in opposition for 10 years. And when you go from government to opposition, you leave the responsibility of governing, which takes up a lot of time for members and cabinet ministers on the other side. You leave that responsibility, and your focus becomes almost entirely political. And I'd like to add that there's nothing wrong with that, because politics is fundamental to our democratic system. It's how the will of the people, it's how the priorities and concerns of the people get translated into government decisions. And how does that happen? It happens because we have election campaigns and parties put forth platforms that are intended to reflect the wishes of the voters and to be elected on those platforms. And the opposition's role is to point out imperfections in the government's approach. And oftentimes we've seen that persistent opposition attention to an issue will result in the government modifying its approach to the issue. And that's what makes our democracy so effective and efficient and so wonderful. So there is nothing wrong with the fact that there's a political angle in this committee and in the House of Commons. And I would say that politics is as old as the hills, Madam Chair. It predates democracy. It is everywhere. It is in corporations. It is in educational institutions. It is in nonprofit organizations. It is in sports. I would submit to you that probably the most difficult political decision in sport is being coach of the Montreal Canadiens. So politics is everywhere. Politics is everywhere. And Mr. Fergus before was speaking about so eloquently and with great erudition on the arc of history. The arc of history, and I know that others have touched on this in their comments. The arc of history. What has really been the common thread through the evolution of society over the last how many hundreds or thousands of years? It is that we have been moving from a system that is arbitrary, sometimes cruelly arbitrary, where power resided in a tyrant or a king who could make decisions on a whim that caused great harm to some people. We are moving slowly and sometimes up and down, I agree, as Mr. Fergus said, towards a system that is not governed by the subjective, but by the objective. A system that is not arbitrary, that is system-based. A system that is rational, I should say. A system where, while we recognize that politics is fundamental to democracy, we also recognize that there are certain instances when for the greater good of the system itself, for the integrity of the system itself, and for the faith that the people who vote place in the system, that we have to take politics out of the process. We do this with courts of law. You know, there's a misunderstanding generally, I think, in many quarters, and you know, this is natural in a way, that when a judge hands down a decision, somehow it's a matter of opinion. That, you know, oh yes, the court decided this because oh, that's the judge, you know, whatever, that's his or her experience and his or her bias. But the system we've built painfully over decades and centuries is a system whereby those who are making decisions of that nature must take themselves out of the decision. They must base their decision on logic, on law, on rules, on evidence, on precedents. And of course, we know that precedence is very important in our system. So this is the kind of world that we are wisely moving towards every day. And as part of that process, we've made many important steps forward since the time that Mr. Angus and I have been in this House. When I arrived here, I sat on the Government Operations Committee. I would actually, Madam Chair, I would encourage every new member to try and sit on that committee, because it looks at the essence of how government operates, and it deals with all kinds of ethical questions as well. But one of the first things we did on that committee after I was elected is that we reviewed a law called the Whistleblowers Act. And the Whistleblowers Act was another attempt to take politics out of important matters of government. And we heard from witnesses who had been whistleblowers and had been treated the way that subjects might have been treated under kings and queens 500-600 years ago. They were humiliated because they brought a wrong to the fore. They were mistreated. They lost their jobs. They were under incredible mental stress. And this law was brought in to give them due process, to make sure that they could lodge a complaint without experiencing retribution. But that law is a non-political law. That's a non-political process, because it's a very important part of maintaining a system of government based on rules and integrity. The Ethics Commissioner's position is very much the same. It's an attempt, and a successful one, to have someone who is not political make decisions about very, very important matters, Madam Chair. So I think this is very important to keep in mind. We're a political committee, or I'm not normally a member of this committee, but it's a political committee, and the Ethics Commissioner is a non-political person who cannot afford to let politics enter into the process which he oversees. Now, I think it's very important that we understand that that the public is very, very cognizant of what constitutes overreach. I've been in politics for a number of years, and you can tell right away when that the public can see through a ruse or some kind of situation that really goes beyond what is necessary. And I think that the public understands that dragging, those who are not part of the immediate family of a politician before a political committee for the purpose of maybe scoring political points and exposing their employment activities, they understand that may not be fair, and that it's best left to a non-political person to examine those relationships and those employment activities and report on them, of course. So I think the public understands what is fair and decent. And I would submit that to examine the contracts of of someone who's not part of an immediate family who would normally have to report their activities anyway to the ethics commissioner, to extend that scope to people who are really not directly related to the situation at hand is not necessarily the most effective and decent approach, Madam Chair. I'd also like to take a couple of minutes to talk about the current context in which we are living. This is the greatest national emergency situation since the Second World War. I think everyone recognizes that. And the government is not perfect. That's why we have an opposition. The government has rolled out a series of programs in electric speed, really. Designed them and rolled them out with great alacrity in a very short period of time. And yes, there will be bumps in the road. And the government recognized that no program would be perfect, and therefore it adjusted a number of programs. It adjusted the CERB when it realized that those whose incomes might have dropped by 90% but were still working would have no support. It decided that there should be a ceiling on how much you can earn before you lose the CERB, and that ceiling was determined to be $1,000. It then adapted the wage subsidy program, including extending the timeline for the wage subsidy program. It brought in a special loan program for small and medium-sized businesses, and when it found that some of the criteria were too restrictive, it admitted that it was not a perfect design, and it adapted the program so that more business people could benefit from it. And then it realized that students were put in a very difficult position. Students, by the way, whose unemployment rate is over 30%, were in a very difficult position because through no fault of their own, they saw the prospect of their summer employment evaporate overnight. Summer employment on which they depend to earn money to pay tuition, but also other living expenses. And so the government brought out a program very quickly to help students as well. Again, it allowed students to earn up to $1,000 and still benefit from the Canadian Student Emergency Benefit. Now, it's often said that students are, or the youth are our future, students are our future, and it's not just a cliche. We were talking about universities and the education system, and we have one of the best in the world. And the more students that benefit from an education, the better our country will be in the short, medium, and long term. So it's very important to support students. And we know that through the introduction of all of these programs, I think Canadians know this. They know it deep down, that the intent of the Prime Minister and of the government was first and foremost in every case to stand by Canadians in their moment of need, including students. Now, we've heard, for example, from the volunteer sector. We all have many nonprofit groups and charities in our ridings, and I think we, as members of Parliament, regardless of party, we know these groups very well, and we know the important work that they do. And we know that there is a crisis in volunteering, Madam Chair, that a generation that ardently contributed to the voluntary sector is now retired, and they have to pass the torch to another generation. And we've heard anecdotally, but also I think it's in serious studies, that there is a shortage of volunteers. and that maybe not as many young people were stepping in to take up the challenge of volunteering. And we know that when a person volunteers, the impact on them is so profound. The feeling they get of doing good, of contributing, is so powerful that they remain volunteers for the rest of their lives. So this program that was designed in good faith, and it was not perfect, but had to be rolled out very quickly. This program was intended to connect young people to the volunteer experience, not only to allow them to to acquire skills that would help them in their careers, but also to create a lifelong engagement towards volunteering activities, which will only be of positive benefit to our society in the long run. Now, I think it bears mentioning that government cannot do everything. And I know my colleagues across the way, yeah, they're too, but I know you know, well, but my colleagues across the way have often said, excusez, c'est une question un peu idéologique.
It's a bit of an ideological issue I'm raising here.
Often say governments cannot do everything. And I agree. Yeah, but and I agree, governments cannot do everything. And that is why when the government, at the beginning of this crisis, understood that food banks were facing increased requests from those in need, when it decided that it wanted to support food banks, it went to organizations that had broad reach, national scope. It went to Food Banks Canada. It went to the Salvation Army. And when the government decided that it wanted to help the nonprofit sector because their revenues from donations were dropping precipitously, the government said, we can't do this ourselves. We can't do everything. And they went to see organizations like United Way, Centraide in Quebec. And so clearly, when it came time to rolling out in very quick time a national volunteer program for youth, the public service recognized that we, the We organization, and it was said at Finance Committee yesterday, the We organization had the reach, the network, the goodwill of youth, and it had the technological capability to handle that kind of rollout. Were there bumps in the road? Yes, Madam Chair, there were. And there always will be in government. Now, that is really essentially the context in which we are having this discussion today. But I think the main point that I'm trying to make, and that I believe my other colleagues have made, is that we have a very robust system for examining and investigating questions of ethics. And we, as a parliament, as a previous parliaments, thought that this issue was so important, this matter of ethics is so important that it should be put in the hands of a non-political person, a qualified non-political person, to conduct due process. And that these matters needed to be dealt with in that way so that the political dimension not interfere with due process, which, if it does not serve our democracy well, because it diminishes the faith that Canadians have in the systems that we have given ourselves and the institutions we've given ourselves as a democracy. So I think, we need to recognize that this committee has important work to do. It has an important mandate, and I think that it's important to point out that when Ms. Shanahan spoke about mandate, what she was getting at is that this committee has a nonpartisan role to play. It has a nonpartisan role to play, that it is, despite the fact, as Mr. Angus said, that committees can decide what they want to do. Nonetheless, they operate within frameworks, and especially a committee as important as the Ethics Committee has an interest in focusing on the broader principles and due process. That is the point that Ms. Shanahan was making. Not that committees are somehow constrained and do not have the liberty to look into what they want to, but that it is very important that the Ethics Committee act in a professional and maybe a little less political manner than perhaps other committees, because it is important that the Ethics Committee maintains the faith of Canadians. So, Madam Speaker, yes.
But if you're going to finish off, then I will hold my question.
Mr. Angus, I'm afraid that's not a point of order.
And yet he's so experienced in the House.
Okay.
He should know this by now.
Point of order.
Why he's experienced in the House.
Mr. Angus.
Thank you. It's been fascinating. I think I'm at the 20th century or 21st century, but I'm not sure because I keep losing my place with his. But about the issue of ethics, I just think is really important. Could he explain to us, if the Ethics Committee is so important to the Liberals, why they shut down the Ethics Commissioner from coming to give his last report on the Trudeau findings of guilt? If they believe that we're supposed to work with the Ethics Commissioner, how come they continue to interfere with the work of our committee to find out the recommendations of the Ethics Commissioner every time Justin Trudeau's found guilty? That would be very helpful, but maybe he's not at the 21st century yet.
I think Mr. Angus is not following the procedure.
Mr. Scarpellaccio.
Yeah. Again, Mr. Angus is a good debater. I will give him that. So I am very. I think this committee has important work to do. I'm told that it is supposed to be reviewing the ethics, the law governing the Ethics Commissioner, Conflict of Interest Act. And because, as a Liberal, I believe that we must always look to reform our systems and make them better, I think that would be an important task, would be to have a look at the Conflict of Interest Act. I don't know personally the last time it was looked at and amended, but like all institutions, like all laws, they merit to be reviewed and to be improved. So, Madam Speaker, again, I just want to say that I appreciate the professional manner in which you chair this committee, and I know we've debated in the House a couple of times, and I know you to be an ardent and articulate debater. And I thought when I came here, maybe you would bring that ardor to your role, but you have managed the committee with a firm hand and made sure that people respect the rules. And for that, I thank you. And I think for that, the committee is well served. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Moving on down my speakers list to Mr. Barrett.
Okay, thanks, Madam Chair. It's hard to, I would like to go and address each of the points that the Liberal members of the committee made, but in doing so, we'd certainly need to clear our calendars for the weekend, which I'm prepared to do. I'm not sure if that's the hard ball that Mr. Fergus was promising that they would play if we pursued this motion. With respect to the Conservative members on this committee, there was an inference that they were not in compliance with the conflict of interest code for members with respect to filing their disclosures. As is reported on that website by the Office of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, Madam Chair, all members are completing the process as required. 2 members' results have been published, and 1 result is waiting, being published by the Commissioner's office. If anyone is so curious as to know who I have the privilege of co-owning my house with, which financial institution, they're welcome to take a peek. And that's the case for the Conservative members. So I'm not sure if that was the hard ball that we were promised, but also apples and oranges. We're not talking about the Conflict of Interest Code for members. We're talking about the Conflict of Interest Act. And so these are different. And I'm also not going to give a lecture to the members today about that. And I'm not going to read them sections of the criminal code that may have been violated by Justin Trudeau. I'm not going to reread the Trudeau Report 1 into the record. I'm not going to reread the Trudeau Report 2 into the record. These were the findings where Justin Trudeau had broken that law, the Conflict of Interest Act, earning the distinction being the first Prime Minister in Canada to have been found guilty of that. And he's in the company of his Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, who broke that law, the Conflict of Interest Act, and is now under investigation again. We're here to talk about this first motion, and I heard from multiple members about how it would be inappropriate to call members of family members of an elected official to this committee, and that was it was inferred that that's what was on offer here. Absolutely not. I'll tell you, the only member of the Trudeau family that I want to see at this committee is Justin. If he wants to come to this committee, that would satisfy me to no end. But that's not consistent with the behavior of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He obstructed the Ethics Commissioner's investigation in the SNC-Lavalin scandal. That is a fact. That is a matter of public record. It is in the Trudeau Report 2. He invoked cabinet confidence, which we heard from Minister Chagger in the House that was not the case when I asked her in committee 2 weeks ago. It's a fact. Did not waive cabinet confidence as promised. So that's what needs to happen here. We need the facts. And I would love to know why asking for these documents when we have this nearly $1 billion agreement. You can really call it whatever gives you comfort or whatever satisfies the Prime Minister's office in their direction to you. But it's $1 billion of taxpayers' money going to an organization with direct financial dealings with the Prime Minister's family. And I heard people talk about Stephen Harper. I know the Liberals are panicked when they start talking about Stephen Harper. And that's what's happening today. And I want to reference Prime Minister Harper, who, first of all, laid this
Point of order, Madam Chair. Can you add me on the speakers list, please?
I know the Liberals are in trouble when they start talking about Stephen Harper, who, like in a cartoon, you lay a rake on the lawn for another cartoon character to step on and it whacks them in the face. That's the Conflict of Interest Act with these Liberals. They can't help but not step on this rake. It hits them in the face over and over and over again. And Prime Minister Harper, who had the foresight to lay this out, this very transparent law for public office holders to follow, the Liberals can't help themselves but to break the law in this case. And with respect to Prime Minister Harper, I'd like to reference his decision to recuse himself from any decisions dealing with Talisman Energy. This was reported in 2012 in the Ottawa Citizen that the Prime Minister recused himself, and the reason was his brother was an employee there. And he wanted to avoid the appearance of a conflict of interest. So just we don't need to go back to Plato, and we don't need to practice our Latin, to look at very recent and relevant examples of why what we're doing here is essential to preserve public confidence in our institutions. And let's look back to 2017. Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government gives more than $1 million to his friends at We, campaign contributors, the founders of that organization. They donated to his leadership. They employ members of his family. And he hands them, here's $1 million, have a July 2nd event on the stage here in Ottawa, and I'll bring my mom. Why won't they tell us if she was paid? Those are taxpayer dollars. So I'm not looking for Margaret Trudeau to come to this committee. But what we're asking for, nor am I looking for Ms. Gregoire Trudeau to come to this committee, nor am I looking for his brother Alexandre to come to this committee. But he's put them in a terrible, terrible position by not recusing himself from this decision. He apologized for it, so he recognized what he did was wrong. So now he needs to follow through and be transparent, and he needs to appear at the committees that are requesting him to come. My motion is not asking for anyone to appear at this committee. It's looking for records, documents, as reported on in media. So there's no fishing expedition or witch hunt. This is a matter of public interest, and it's a matter of preserving confidence in public institutions. The slow roll through this meeting, and I know we're going to hear more from the government members of this committee, and that's fine. But I just wonder, what do you have to hide? Why the attempt at a cover-up? Why not just vote on the motion? Have the courage of your convictions. Don't run out the clock. Vote. If you disagree with it, we've heard from all members on your side now. We're going to hear from Mr. McKinnon in a second. I can't wait. Let's have a vote. I know there's other committee business to deal with. I look forward to seeing how you vote. But we've heard what you think. You're confused by the motion. I hope I've clarified that for you. We're not looking for these people to come to committee. There's one Trudeau that I would want to come here, and it is Justin. And I would like him to not invoke cabinet confidence. I would like him to bring all relevant documents. If someone is proposing that we bring a Trudeau here, I'm not today, but sure. If we're going to bring a member of Justin Trudeau's family, let's bring him. But if that's an amendment that the government would like to move, to have Justin Trudeau come to this committee, I will tell you now, I will vote in favor of your amendment. If you are not moving that amendment, let's talk about the motion. The motion is for these records pertaining to speaking appearances. I think that's pretty innocuous. We were going to give the organization $1 billion to hand out. They were going to benefit by $43.5 million. Nothing to hide. Let's see them. I'm not looking for their tax returns. Not looking for their pay stubs. These folks are dragged into this by virtue of the Prime Minister failing to recuse himself from these deliberations, which he admits was wrong. But just because you say sorry after you get caught robbing the bank doesn't mean that there is an investigation. It doesn't mean that there won't be a trial, and it doesn't mean that there won't be consequences. This committee is the master of its own domain. We've heard that the government members want us to respect the mandate of this committee. That was not the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner certainly wasn't the case when we wanted to bring him here to report out on his work on the Trudeau Report 2, him finding that the Prime Minister broke the law, the Conflict of Interest Act, for a second time. Didn't see any support from that from government members, which is inconsistent with what you're saying here today. So let's talk about this. So we've had a history lesson. Thank you. I hope that I get credit from Madame Briere's alma mater. I will apply it to future learnings. I have a college in my riding, St. Lawrence College. Happy to have him. Since we're doing academic shout-outs, they're great. Higher learning for sure. It's but all. So we've had some fun. We've heard about people's past. We've heard about ancient history. We've had linguistic lessons. Let's instead talk about this. I've heard no amendments from the government. I've heard no effort to call Justin Trudeau because they said that there's someone from his family that someone wants to come here. Yes, invite the Prime Minister to testify at this committee, and I will support your amendment. And I think that would show that there's been an examination of conscience in the Liberal caucus room. That it's not just about politics; it's about doing what's right. And so I agree with my colleague who said that let's depoliticize. Okay,
Chair. I'd like to put a motion motion on the floor.
Motion cannot be put forward during a point of order.
That we do now adjourn.
Yeah, I'm sorry. During a point of order, you cannot put a motion forward. Thank you.
But isn't this a privileged motion?
During a point of order, you cannot put that motion forward.
Okay, so I withdraw my point of order, and I am putting forward a privileged motion that we do now adjourn.
You cannot do that unless you are on the speaking list, at which point then I would call upon you, and then you could move a motion.
Okay.
Do you wish to be added to the speaking list? Okay.
So it's laid bare for everyone to see that the Liberals have attempted to filibuster this committee. Ms. Shanahan has demonstrated the Liberal cover-up. You talked the clock till 2 o'clock, and now you don't want to deal with any of this committee's business. For shame. That's politics, Mr. Scarpellegia. That's naked partisan politics. That's exactly what you said we shouldn't do here. Vote on the motion. Have the courage of your convictions. And that's not what we're seeing here. I thought we respected the committee's mandate. Is the committee's mandate not to vote on the motions put forward by the members? That's fascinating to me. So we read from procedural texts. We read historical texts. We've written new texts. So I wonder how that translates in the streets of your constituencies. Would you feel the same way of another party who had a prime minister who awarded a non-tendered contract worth nearly $1 billion, nearly $1 billion, to an organization that paid his family hundreds of thousands of dollars? Would you feel the same way? I wager you wouldn't. But here we are, looking to clean up another one of Justin Trudeau's messes. A third time he's under investigation. And though it may not concern members in the Liberal caucus room, it concerns constituents in my riding. It concerns people across this country, non-political people. It's an embarrassment to have a prime minister who has been found guilty of breaking the law multiple times, under investigation again. Great smugness we often hear in trying to contrast the head of government in our country against the President of the United States. So often, the smugness that comes. I feel no moral superiority to any nation when this is what we see here in Canada. It's so I'm not sure if again, to go back to Mr. Fergus's point, if hardball was to read from the public disclosure on the website that Mr. Gourde and I, the results have been published from our public disclosures, or that Mr. Keurig has completed his part on time. He has completed his disclosure with the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner's office. But like everyone else, like other public servants, There are technological limitations to their being able to discharge their duties in the same time they normally would. But he filed on time. So if there's an issue to be taken, I encourage government members to raise that. But as far as resources go, that's not for the opposition members to have to seize themselves with at this committee. We're talking about the Conflict of Interest Act, but with respect to that code, members on the Conservative side have met their obligations. If playing hardball is filibustering the committee, running the clock till 2 o'clock, and slyly, moving a point of order to try and adjourn the committee, it's clumsy, but it's not. But I'm not sure if that's hardball. It's consistent with my experience during the hearings on the SNC-Lavalin scandal, the cover-up that the majority Liberals tried to effect there. That's consistent with my experience. It's consistent with Canadians' experience with Justin Trudeau. So Liberal members have demonstrated that should this committee look to be the master of its own domain, that should they wish to exercise their mandate to review ethical matters dealing with public office holders, that they'll filibuster when it's their prime minister they're trying to protect. They saw Jerry Butts fall in disgrace. They saw Michael Wernick fall in disgrace under Justin Trudeau. They saw their majority reduced to a minority, a distinction again that Justin Trudeau has. First-term majority governments usually become second-term majority governments when they've been elected for the first time. If they're first elected as a majority and not in office as a minority first, the probability is that they will be re-elected a second time, but with a majority. Not the case for Justin Trudeau, because Canadians put the Liberals on a shorter leash, having those ethical violations the first time. It should be concerning for all Canadians that the government doesn't want that accountability, doesn't have the courage of their convictions to vote on the motion on the table, knowing that their other colleagues gave notice of motion in advance of the meeting, gave you time to prepare a response, and to articulate that to your fellow committee members and to Canadians. That's not accountability. That's not open government open by default that you all ran under. That's not using sunlight as the best disinfectant, as you promised. That's not sunny ways that we heard from Justin Trudeau. It's obstruction. It does a disservice to Canadians. It does a disservice to your constituents. Mr. Scarpellegia mentioned the testimony we heard yesterday at Finance Committee. And the contention that We Charity was the only organization in the country that could carry out this sole source deal. Well, when you only ask one person, if you don't ask anybody else what their capabilities are, guess what the answer is going to be? If you ask Google to give you a document that says, you know, are you the best search engine? And here are some of the requirements that we'd like you to show us so that we can endorse you as the best search engine, but you don't ask anybody else. Well, they're going to demonstrate the standard that you asked for, and then they're going to get your endorsement. We Charity was the only one who responded to this. It wasn't competitive. And we heard also that it was Ms. Wernick who came up with this on her own. She testified yesterday was a finance official who proposed We Charity. We heard from Mr. Scarpelagia that there's a crisis in Canada. Young people aren't volunteering. That's not what the head of Volunteer Canada said at committee yesterday. He said young people in Canada are very generous with their time. Very generous. We also heard yesterday that this call for 100,000 volunteers, it's not consistent with what she understands in her industry, in her sector, as being the need. A vastly inflated number. That was the testimony at Finance yesterday. But here we are at Ethics, just having endured a multi-hour Liberal filibuster as part of the cover-up into Justin Trudeau's third ethics scandal, and selective reading of texts and ancient history lessons have got us no closer to any transparency. But you know that when we hear about hardball and and assuming that the better angels are on the government side of the table, that there's something more here. We're on to some trouble. There's something I heard at Finance Committee yesterday too. One of my colleagues say we're on to some trouble here with this Liberal government, and I think he's right. Multiple investigations by independent officers of Parliament, and here we are today with government members, Liberal members of this committee, in a coordinated effort, engaging in a cover-up to not allow this committee to do its work. So, Mr. Fergus said that you'd play hardball. Okay, well, Mr. Fergus, I think if you check the record, you'll see that that's what you said. And
point of information, Madam Chair. Point of order. I think if Mr. Barrett, who has made 6 references to hardball and attributing that to me, if you'll take a look at the record, I certainly didn't say that in English, and I certainly didn't give, at least as far as I know, I didn't use that term in French. It's not a term I regularly use. So perhaps it had been translated that way, but that certainly wasn't the intention of what I had meant.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Barrett.
Well, I'll clip it for you and send it to you later, Greg, because that's what was said. And it's obstructionist tactics are not what Canadians look for. So we had the dare, I guess, that you'd play hardball. Well, I dare you to vote on the motion and have the courage of your convictions. Move to adjourn. For shame. So let's wrap it up, and let's vote on this motion and then the other motions that committee members want to bring forward. You seem eager to have someone from Justin Trudeau's family come. Let's bring Justin Trudeau. I dare him.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Moving down my speaking list, Mr. Angus.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I don't know if I've said it yet today, but thank you for doing such an excellent job of keeping everybody on their respective sides without us going into the middle and breaking parliamentary procedures. So thank you so much. And it's been a fascinating day. Certainly we learned a lot about Madame Breyer's long history at her college, university. We learned about ancient Athens. We went through the medieval era. So if you'll indulge me, I'll quote scripture. The book of Luke. You didn't know that I was an altar boy, did you? Well, I was. And in the book of Luke, it says that what is done in the darkness will be shouted from the rooftops, and what is whispered in the back rooms will be shown to all. And I think that this is what happens when we end up with corruption scandals and conflict of interest, is it's embarrassing for the government. I don't go back as far as Athens, but in my time in Parliament, I've seen I've seen a lot of the tawdry, slapping, rum bottle politics on the Rideau that we're famous for, all the tawdry deals. I remember I came in just after Jean Chrétien spent a couple $1 billion on golf balls. I remember Brian Mulroney getting money in a brown paper bag and explaining that to Canadians. Bruce Carson, I've seen that one. Mike Duffy, Nigel Wright. And the work of this committee has been sometimes very raucous and very confrontational, but it is this committee that tries to establish some review of the ethical behaviors of parliamentarians. We are not a technical committee. We are a political committee, as my good friend Mr. Scarpaleggia said, and it falls to us to sometimes bring these issues into the public light. And I have been quoted extensively, so I feel I might have a life here beyond my limited career. If other people do quote me in perpetuity, it might speak for how long I've been on this committee. And the issue of the integrity of documents is something I've spoken up before, and I've spoken it up when we've had Liberals in power and Conservatives in power, and we do need to establish precedents, and I think that's really important. I think what makes this issue difficult is that we had the We Charity state publicly that no money was paid to the Trudeaus, and that was false. So the question of trusting them on this is it raises questions now that have to be answered. What were those financial relations? Because the refusal of the Prime Minister and Mr. Morneau to recuse themselves has raised ethical questions that must be answered. And we have had 2 other findings of guilt against the Prime Minister where we've tried to have the Ethics Commissioner report to our committee and we've been blocked by the government. So how do we make recommendations about how things should be done if the government refuses to let the Ethics Commissioner speak to our committee so that we can present to Parliament for a report that would suggest changes? And if we had done that on the previous 2 findings of guilt, Mr. Trudeau may not be in the situation he is now, because maybe there would have been some measures put in place. And Madame Breyer was great about talking about how we have these standards. Well, we have standards, but if those in power refuse to respect them, we have a problem. And this is why the Prime Minister is under his 3rd investigation. So we could talk all night. I've been in many long filibusters, but I am just a conflict of interest. My own family members, I should put it out in case someone finds out. I am actually trying to move one of my daughters this weekend, and that's a conflict of interest for me because I'm a lot more afraid of my wife than I am of the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, and I have to help move my daughter. So I'm trying to bring us together. So I've heard the Liberals say again and again and again that they think it's inappropriate that the financial records of the Trudeau family be brought before our committee, and they keep mentioning the Ethics Commissioner. And I certainly heard my Conservative colleagues suggest that we want to hear Justin Trudeau speak, because it's Justin Trudeau who put his family in this situation. It was his choice. And it was we's choice to start paying the Trudeau family after he became Prime Minister that put them within a very fair discussion about political influence. So I would offer a friendly amendment that we would, as in the New Democrats, support this committee calling for the records, the financial records, to be obtained from we and transferred to the Ethics Commissioner, so that, again, we're not turning this into a family circus, but we want those documents turned over. If they were turned over to the Ethics Commissioner, if the Liberals supported that, then that would back up everything they said for the last 3 hours, excluding all the stuff they said about medieval kings and princes and ancient Athens and all the other stuff. But the gist of it was they kept saying, trust the Ethics Commissioner. We would put that forward in a friendly amendment if we could say that we call on Justin Trudeau to explain his role in this and the decisions he made, because the Liberals have said again and again and again that it's not fair to draw on the family members, it's the office holders. So the public office holder, if Mr. Trudeau agrees to come here, we would agree to transfer the documents, the financial documents of the Trudeau family and the We Corporation to the Ethics Commissioner. So he gets to decide what's going to be released or not released, and we get to hear from the public office holder. So I would make that as a friendly amendment if my colleagues are interested, and then we could vote on this, and then we could go home and I could go move my daughter and not be in serious conflict with my family. But other than that, I'm willing to stay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. I just want to be clear here then. Are you moving an amendment to this motion right now?
Yes, I am.
Then would you please help us understand the wording of your amendment?
That pursuant to Standing Orders 1083H, the committee review the safeguards which are in place to avoid and prevent conflicts of interest in federal government procuring, contracting, grant contribution, and other expenditures, to provide a case study for this review. In order, the committee do issue to the Speaker Spotlight for a copy of all records pertaining to speaking appearances arranged since October 14th, 2008 for Justin Trudeau, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, Margaret Trudeau, and Alexandre Trudeau, including in respect of each speaking appearance, an indication of the fee provided, any expenses that were reimbursed with the name of the company and the person providing it, and that these records shall be provided to the Ethics Commissioner for his study, and that this committee calls upon Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to appear to give testimony relating to these matters.
So just to be clear, you are asking then that those records be submitted to the Ethics Commissioner and the clerk of this committee?
The Ethics Commissioner.
Okay.
And that the committee calls upon Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to testify regarding these matters to us.
Okay. Just one moment here, Ms. Shanahan. Are you good on that? Are you good on that? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Angus.
Could I call a timeout then? Can I ask for a timeout so that we can digest that?
You're asking me to suspend the meeting?
Yes.
Just give me one moment.
Actually, it might be good for a bathroom break for a few people too. Just saying.
I'll tell you what. Why don't we suspend for 5 minutes? It will allow people to use the restroom should they need to. And it will also allow the analyst and the clerk and I to confer and to just make sure that we have the wording of this amendment correct. All right, I will suspend 5 minutes.
Is it a new speakers list for the amendment?
For the amendment, yes, we begin a new speakers list.
Okay.
Do you wish to be added?
Yes, please.
Yes, Mr. Angus.
As a point of order, because I'm offering a friendly amendment, does my colleague have to accept the friendly amendment and then we begin the discussion? I'm moving the amendment?
No, the amendment.
Okay.
The amendment is put on the floor.
Okay, the amendment's on the floor? Okay.
The amendment is put on the floor for the committee to debate.
Okay.
At which point then I will move to a vote.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Sorry, just wanting to make sure I have the speakers list correct here. Mr. Fergus, you had your hand up. Mr. Carrick, do you have a point of order or you're wanting to be on the speakers list? Thank you. Mr. McKinnon. Okay. I will remind the committee that we are now entering into debate on the amendment that has been moved by Mr. Angus. And so I move into a new speakers list for the amendment, starting with Ms. Shanahan.
Thank you, Chair. And actually, for the purpose of everyone here, could we have the clerk read out the I guess the full the amendment and where it would be situated in the motion. Thank you.
I'll ask the clerk to read that into the mic.
So the amendment moved by Mr. Angus would follow the words, provided that these records shall be provided to the, and the amendment would read, Ethics Commissioner, and that this committee calls upon Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to appear before it.
The motion, if we, at the end.
Right here.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes, Mr. Carrick.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And a point of clarification to Mr. Angus's motion, being that it's a little bit fluid. I hope the committee will indulge this. But was it meant to be an either or? Is it provide the documents to the Ethics Commissioner or the Prime Minister come and testify, or be compelled to testify? Just like a little bit more clear language around that, and if that is in fact the full extent of what you were intending.
If I can just clarify, that we would agree to have the documents transferred to the Ethics Commissioner, and they would agree that the Prime Minister would testify.
Sure.
And then, of course, if they don't, then we're back to the original motion, which we're more than ready to vote on.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mr. Angus.
Floor. So it is my understanding then that it is the wish under this amendment that the documents be transferred directly to the Ethics Commissioner. Do not stop at go kind of thing, just directly to. And so, to that aspect, I guess I'm just wondering why that is even necessary, since the Commissioner has full powers to call for any documents, any I suppose any record, any thing that he has need of in the execution of his duties. I'm just posing that question because it has been very edifying this afternoon. We've sort of done three studies here in one, where we are all trying to get an understanding on how the Act works and how the Office of the Commissioner works. And that is my understanding, is that the Commissioner has those powers already. So for that reason, I'm just a little confused as to why that would be considered an important amendment. It's as if we're telling the Commissioner how to do his job, and I think that is, again, outside the remit. I think we can have that kind of discussion once he has completed his review. In fact, that's why we have the Commissioner appear before us once he has actually tabled his report, to ask exactly, what were the processes that he went through, why did he do X, Y, and Z. I can see that. But I'm not sure that is necessary. I mean, I could be wrong. I'm throwing that out there. And then on the issue of the Prime Minister appearing, I think the Prime Minister appears almost daily and has been very open. He has already apologized for his actions or lack thereof. And so I don't see the validity of that either. But I understand that it's important that we have, that we do some kind of reflection on this. So I think that we want to reflect further on this amendment, and happy to come back to another meeting, actually, to resolve it. So that's where I would leave it then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Angus, for for trying to bridge the gap and come up with a solution. Before I get into the changes which you are suggesting, let me reiterate what my colleague Brenda Shanahan had just said. I think there is a fair bit of merit in what you're proposing. I think I feel that it's important for us to provide this information to the ethics counselor, and if there was an opportunity that we had to adjourn the meeting now and come back to this at a date set for next week on this specific motion, I think there's a few things that can happen. I think we can get to where we want to be. I think it would also give an opportunity, as we all are waiting for. We do know that this is not the only committee that is looking at this matter, and there may be an opportunity for both conditions to be satisfied on this. So I would certainly like to put that out there, that there's an opportunity for us to do this and try to get to the nut of the problem and come to a resolution that I think that could satisfy everyone on each side. But before I get to that, I have to say that my colleague, Mr. Scarpaleggia, is quite right. You are quite the experienced debater, and I do like how you, in all friendliness, take a strip off of me for going back to taking a look at the history of democracy. But yet you would.
Sorry, point of order, Madam Chair. I would never take a strip off Mr. Fergus, specifically when he's talking about ancient Athens. So
you could talk about ancient Athens.
I resent being called a master debater when I'm a high school dropout and played in a punk rock band. But if he wants to continue ragging the puck rather than get to the motion, he can talk about me as long as he wants. But I can stay as long as we need to get this motion dealt with.
That's great,
Mr. Fergus.
Thank you. I can certainly say he keeps on raising the ancient Greece, and yet he goes and will quote Luke. I did know that you had been an altar boy. We've had this conversation in the past. Here you go. Mine too. Getting shorter every day, and which is really quite funny because we're only about 400 years off of each other in terms of deciding to quote from figures in the past. So over a period of 2,500 years, that's sort of chump change. But anyhow, he's very good at making me feel that the push of that, and yet we do know that he's quoting from sources which are frankly in most people's minds almost just as old. I would like to also return to and to correct the record again with Mr. Barrett. I am really quite convinced, and I look forward to reading the blues of this committee. But it is not my habit to use that term, hardball, and I certainly didn't say that in English. If that is what came across in French through the translation, first of all, hats off to our interpreters who do a phenomenal job day in and day out, making sure that they can provide us with all the work, with all our words, and to share that not only with members here but with Canadians abroad. Also, chapeau aux interprètes qui sont toujours là.
Hats off to the interpreters that are always there. But I can tell you one thing. I don't even know how to say hardball in French. So I'm not sure I could have said it in French to have ended up with that translation.
I think the whole thing that we really get back to, and this is where I think we have a pretty positive approach to this whole debate, is that I think that what half of that suggestion that Mr. Angus has brought forward is one which I really believe is one that we should do, and one which I've argued for. at some length, one which my colleagues have argued for at some length, that we should take this matter and provide it directly to the Commissioner of Ethics. De cette façon-là, on est assuré.
In this way, we can be sure that we're going to remove the possibility of playing politics with this file. And as members of Parliament, as representatives, we will give the Ethics Commissioner the chance to get all the information deemed necessary. I would imagine that if it's relevant, the Commissioner could have obtained this information for himself. But if we want to be doubly careful, I have no problem with that. What I would like to propose, if I may, Madam Chair, is that we do adjourn now. This way, we will have the opportunity to consider this amendment, this change, and that we meet as soon as possible next week to resolve this situation. And then we may vote on the amendment. I hope that that is agreeable to all of my colleagues around the table.
So just to be clear, Mr. Fergus, then, you are putting forward a motion that the committee would now adjourn, that this meeting would be adjourned, the debate would be suspended, and that it would be continued at the earliest time possible on Monday.
Earliest time possible.
Or earliest time possible? Okay. And I just want to make sure then that is correct.
That would be correct.
Okay.
With that change at the end.
Okay. So earliest time possible.
Sans le même moment, point d'ordre.
Point of order.
I'm sorry?
Sans être en conflit.
Without coming into conflict with the Finance Committee, which is virtual.
Mr. Fergus, is this a part of your
Si
amendment?
ça c'est agréable à Madame.
If it is agreeable to Madame Gaudreau, I have no problem with that. We want to facilitate the participation of all members, including those who are doing double duty with the Finance Committee.
Okay. Thank you. Just give me one moment, please.
Ah, merci. Que je peux juste clarifier une affaire?
Could I just clarify one thing, please?
Juste clarifier que je sais.
I just want to clarify. I know that the clerk is discussing with the various whips offices to find a way, to find a time to have the meeting. And so subject to those discussions, I don't want to put you in a tight spot. I want to leave you some leeway to have the discussions with the whips of all the political parties in order to settle on a date that works for everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Angus, I see that you have your hand up. Is it on a point of order?
A point of order, and if I could be indulged, just because when we get to a vote on an adjournment, we just have to vote. But I've had two contradictory positions from the Liberals, so I'm not sure if I'm going to stay here or I'm going. So I just want to ask Mr. Fergus to clarify, because we were told by Ms. Shanahan that the Ethics Commissioner can get whatever documents he wants. I'm not interested in that. We have the right to draw documents from our committee. So we're saying we will draw those documents and transfer them to the Ethics Commissioner to respect the privacy of the Trudeau family. But if we don't have that, we will still draw those documents. I'm waiting to know whether or not they will push to have the Prime Minister testify. If they're saying they're going to come back with a goodwill offer, then I'm willing to adjourn. If I don't hear that, then I'm willing to stay all weekend. So I've heard two contradictory positions from the Liberals. So if we get to a vote, if I have clarity, then I'll know which way to vote. If I don't have clarity, I'll vote to stay.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. So to be clear, sorry, Mr. Fergus, just to return to you here, I have a motion on the table by Mr. Fergus asking for the adjournment of this meeting, the suspension of this debate. Attached to that is also the clause that we would reconvene at the earliest time possible. Now, if you want that clause attached, it becomes a debatable motion, which we could not entertain right now because we have an amendment on the floor. However, if you wish to take away your caveat, then of course we can discuss the amendment to adjourn.
In the interest
Or the motion to adjourn.
of folks around the table, I would happily withdraw that caveat, but to reassure my colleagues around the table that this goodwill gesture is a goodwill gesture, and it is not one to try to stymie or to play procedural games on this. So that is so I'll withdraw that caveat so that we can have a debate, and then it is very much a goodwill gesture that we're trying to put forward here.
Okay. So, Mr. Fergus, then you are moving a motion to adjourn this meeting, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. That being said, I must immediately go to a vote, and I go according to the majority of the members at this committee. So it is your will that is respected. Mr. Barrett, there is no debate.
I'd like a recorded vote
for this. Yes, we can do a recorded vote, absolutely. So moving forward then to a vote on Mr. Fergus's motion that this meeting would be adjourned.
All those in favor, please say yay when I call your name. All those opposed, please say nay. Madame Brière? Yay. Mr. Scarpaleggia? Mr. Fergus? Mr. McKinnon? Madame Shanahan? Oui. Mr. Barrett?
No.
Mr. Duncan?
No.
Mr. Couric?
No.
Madame Gaudreau?
No.
Mr. Angus?
Oui.
Thank you. All right. The committee has spoken, and based on the votes as they are counted, we have 6 yes and 4 no. That being the case, the committee is now adjourned.